as being one and the same.
Well, it's five after, so why don't we get this show on the road? For all of you following the live stream or watching the YouTube videos, hello and welcome to the 178th, God help us, installment of Millennia in Microcosm by Kenneth Smith. We're in the section on medieval civilization. And I would tell you all about the things we've been talking about. It is based on a book by philosopher Kenneth Smith. But today is an interlude session. An interlude where, it is part of the way that I'm walking us through this book is by interjecting, if Kenneth Smith points us at Kafka, well, then why don't we look at Kafka? If he points us at Dostoevsky, why don't we look at Dostoevsky? And we're trying to broaden the conversation beyond the text to see the larger world that Kenneth Smith, who was a professor of philosophy, not just a philosopher, is wanting us to experience and think about. He's trying to show his homework. How did he get to his conclusions? He's constantly referencing all of this larger conversation. And I try to do that too. It's why I keep injecting all of the primary source materials from the Greeks and the Romans and now the early Christians. And this week the injection is overwhelming the text. I'm actually setting mostly aside the core our Quran to talk about some philosophy fundamentals that Kenneth Smith takes for granted, and explores and brings up over and over and over. Some of it will come out of the text we're reading, some of it will come out of his other books, some of it will come from left field, things that he's talked about in the past or referred to, or things that any of us have seen that remind us of these core ideas. That Kenneth's talking about. So it's going to be a wide-ranging discussion. It's not, despite the fact that it's not structured by the text today, it's not going to be a lightweight, laid-back conversation. It's going to be fairly intense because we're going to talk about what is the core. Hey, Geneva, love to see you. We're going to talk about what is the core of philosophical thinking? What is the core of heuristic thinking? What is the opposite of heuristic thinking? What is the opposite of philosophical thinking? How can you recognize it when you see it in others? But as Kafka says, far more importantly, how can you recognize it when it's in yourself? Because anyone who can't spot their own ideological thinking is not a philosopher, is not engaging in philosophical thinking. It's a skill we have to develop, we have to learn. And it's as Kenneth likes to say when he talks about the Greek Sisyphus, whose name it means he with the most taste, the most tasteful. It is an art we have to cultivate through lots and lots of practice. There's no short road toward Aristeia or philosophy. So first of all, I just got out of the shower, so I'm a little wet looking, and I want to give a shout out to cartoonist and writer Ali Broche. I don't know how many of you have experienced her cartoons and books like her Hyperbole and a Half, where she talks about her crazy life and the crazy things that she does. She suffers from bipolar and illustrates it hilariously. She's got one which is two panels side by side, and the first one is how I think I look after a shower, and it's her all glamour pose with the glorious hair and the makeup and ha ha ha, and then how I actually look at her hair is just plastered to her head because it's wet and her eyes are gigantic like a fish. And it's like, yes, I know, I just got out of the shower. I'm a little crazy looking today, but over the course of the 3 hours, I shall transform into a beautiful, beautiful butterfly. Isn't that nice? All right. Well, with that sarcasm out of the way, so what is the core of this topic? So throughout all of his books, Kenneth works on a theme that he got from the Greeks, that he got from Nietzsche, that he got from Hannah Arendt, and Kierkegaard and Hegel and Aristotle and Heraclitus and elsewhere. And this theme is that none of us sees the world the way it actually is, but almost all of us think we do. And this is the biggest problem with the human condition. Because so long as we think we see it the way it is, that convinces us not to look further. That convinces us not to question the things that we're wrong about. We just take them for granted because, after all, we're already done. We've already done the work. We are familiar with our own ideas, and that familiarity creates a kind of family scent that makes us think, well, of course they're right. They're the familiar ones. The ideas I have are the right ones, and this smells like one of my ideas, so it must be true. And we don't even know that that's happening. We think we're engaging in rigid Aristotelian logic, that we're being scrutinizing and piercing in our intelligence. Well, actually, all that we're doing is saying, this has my stink on it. so it must be right. He says the unconscious is not nearly as admirable in the way it goes about deciding what's persuasive and what's not, as our conscious mind would like to dress us up to imagine that we are. So, core to this is the idea that there are these two fundamental forms of delusion that are widespread in people. And one of the key writers on delusion is Kierkegaard. In Either Or and other works, he really tries to make as crisp and clear to us as he can how it is that delusion works in human beings. How is it that we can be dead wrong about what we're looking at, and yet while we're looking at it, while we're thinking the thoughts, while we're comparing the thoughts to the thing, to us they look exactly right. Yes, this is definitely right. I don't know if you've ever seen someone did a take on a Norman Rockwell painting. I think it was Norman Rockwell, in which um, he's looking at a picture. He's looking in a mirror, and I think he's a KKK member, and he's got the white hood and all that stuff. And meanwhile, the portrait he's painting is like Captain America. He's like, yeah, that's freedom right there. I am looking at the real stuff. This is me. Oh, Portland. Oh, I'm not in Portland. I'm in Seattle. And yeah, it's a blue sky, baby. Oh, it's so weird. It's so bright out there. Why? Why is this happening? It's February. Well, I'm sure it'll be over in a few days. Uh, so, yes, David Royal says, William James. This is another one of Kenneth Smith's favorite quotes. A great many people think they are thinking when they are merely rearranging their prejudices.
Mm.
Classic. Kenneth loves this quote. And he puts side by side with it one of his own quotes, which is just because you're doing it with your brain doesn't mean it should be called thinking. So the enormous amount of what we do with our brain is the opposite of thinking. As James says, it is confirming and rearranging and adjusting our prejudices. So Kenneth borrows on this existentialist philosophical tradition that says there are two basic categories of delusions. And one of the categories of delusions is what is familiar to us, what emotionally moves us, what we have experiences with. These things must be true, right? This is the delusion of a parochialism that does not recognize itself as parochial, that imagines that the tiny, limited, aspectival view of life, the universe, and everything that one person has is somehow so all-encompassing and godlike that it should count as objective truth. And with words like parochial, we like to imagine medieval villagers. We have the story that medieval villagers never went more than 30 miles from their home, which is probably not true, by the way. But we all say it, and we congratulate ourselves on having flown airplanes to places and driven places. We're so much more cosmopolitan than they are. But of course, that's not what parochial means at all. That's just the roots of the word. Because no matter where you go, you could travel the whole world and still be parochial. It's your perspective that is parochial. It's only one person's perspective, no matter how far you travel. And, we only get 190, 80, 70 years to accumulate experience, and then we're done. This is a tiny, over the billions of years of the earth, this is not even a drop in the bucket. It's such a tiny sample size, but we're all so sure that sample size is enough for us to reach absolute conclusions about. And all of us, says Kenneth, this is where he might differ with William James, is not a great many people. All of us do this. We are hardwired to do this because, I mean, there may be a million different places or a billion or a trillion different places on Earth you could stand and look and gain a different perspective. But the one you're in is the one where the wolf's about to eat you. If you don't privilege the perspective where you're standing, you don't survive. You don't reproduce. That's the end of you. So evolution, it strongly reinforces the parochial perspective. We have very sound reasons for being so committed to it. We all know the story of the man with the hammer. Everything starts to look like a nail, right? So it is a very useful tool. It is an essential tool. It is the fundamental tool of thinking, but it is also a big fat problem at the same time, like the hammer. You can build a lot of things, but you're probably going to try hammering some things you should have left alone. Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I don't think we can get rid of all the delusions because we would lose all motivation. Humanity collectively throughout its history has certain levels of delusion. If those were stripped away, they would lose their motive. For example, we live in a civilization, and that's, well, who's more real? Maybe the Bushman of the Kalahari is the one that's closer to reality, and we're the fools. And if we got rid of that delusion, well, our cities would collapse, wouldn't they? Everything would fall apart. So death would ensue. Uh, how deep does our delusion go that keeps us alive? As Nietzsche said, the good lie. If the lie keeps us alive, then it's a good lie. Thank you.
I'm so glad you said that because I had not stressed that enough. It's critical. Why do we have these parochial delusions? Because we die without them. We would die without them. We would never have evolved without them. It is the gazelle's immersion in the here and now, the this here now of the Serengeti that allows it to not be eaten by the cheetah. And if it's wandering around thinking abstruse thoughts about the nature of existence, it doesn't think them for very long before it's somebody else's meal. These are the things that keep us alive. Stephen is absolutely right on about this. This is why we suffer from this. It isn't just that we were made in a defective way. All organisms share the parochial delusion very strongly. Um, but our problem is we have a second source of delusions as well. And our second source of delusions is the conceptual ideological delusion. And that's because Homo sapiens, more than any other animal, has hyper developed a second um, faculty, base metabolic faculty of the mind. And that is the capacity to abstract, to think according to rules and systems and not according to the this here now, to 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 act like a calculator or a computer, even tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years before any such thing existed, we gained this capacity to think systematically in abstracto. And that's what allows us to look at a tree and see lumber for a house, or look at a rock and see a knife, and from the knife, see, capturing the bison, killing it, cooking it over the fire and eating it, and our children, having full bellies, and all that from looking at a rock. This is abstractivizing and projecting and patterning, and it is a superpower. But like any great tool, like a hammer, the flip side of the coin is that we have a tendency to do exactly what Stephen just warned us not to do. We have to do exactly what the gazelle has no business doing, which is we stand around scratching our heads, gazing up into the stars, and fall into a ditch. Jonathan Swift mocks this in Gulliver's Travels, when Gulliver stops at the island with the philosophers who wander around thinking lofty thoughts while forgetting to eat, sleep, breathe sometimes, and they have to have servants who called flappers, who have a thing, they flap the face, they slap the face of the philosopher from time to time to remind them, no, don't walk in front of that truck. No, that's a ditch. No, no, do not stick that poison in your mouth. Yes, do take a drink of water, because they're so lost to the
What
basics of
was that
survival.
play about Socrates?
Yeah, take it away.
I'm trying to remember it now. It sort of
The clouds.
made him look. What was he doing? He was trying to study the heavens or something like that, and the guy's got him strung up in a basket going across the stage.
Yes. Whee!
Which playwright was that? I'm trying to remember now.
Aristophanes, the clouds.
His head is in the clouds.
Yes. Yes. It's a classic, and it's one of the ways that we know that Plato wasn't lying when he suggested that Socrates was an interesting and well-known person, because here's completely other people writing plays about the guy who's going, and knowing that his audience will get the joke. He knows, it's just this, everybody knows. So we have that problem. But where Socrates' version of the problem was, the unexamined life is not worth living for a man. We have to do justice to the rights of the question. What if we searchingly engage with these questions. In the modern world, we have the opposite form. What if we never think a philosophical life for the rest of our lives? What if all that philosophizing is for dummies? What if the smart thing to do is be pragmatic? Don't ask yourself whether or not it's okay to, to destroy all the kulaks and purge all the bureaus and send everyone off to Siberia to die. Just figure out the most efficient way to get what you want. If the most efficient way is to surprise them and to massacre tens of millions, go for it. Live the dream. This is the modern version of philosophy, is pragmatism, right? It's grotesque. Because it's an anti-philosophy that says don't question, don't ask, don't delve more deeply. There are a lot of ways to be trapped in this abstractivizing mode of the brain. And some of these different ways of doing it hate each other and blame each other for everything and try to present a model of human nature and politics and reality in which all of the options are way over in this abstract left brain analytical stuff. When we start talking categories like liberals and conservatives or left and right, as though they're real things, as though it is appropriate to substitute them for actual living human beings in our calculations, then we are doing exactly what Gulliver's Travels is criticizing us for, exactly what Aristophanes is criticizing us for, and exactly what Hegel says when he says to abstract is to be in error. On the one hand, we wouldn't even be human without this abstractivizing capacity in our minds. E equals MC squared, fly me to the moon, all this stuff that we can do is more belly oriented dwarf wheat, where we can grow enormous amounts of wheat without it falling over and dying because we make it shorter so that the heavy head of the wheat from breeding heavier and heavier and heavier wheat heads, it doesn't cause the stalk to fall over because the stalk is shorter. This is a result of the abstractivizing brain thinking about characteristics and inheritance and breeding and manipulation of the world, and it goes right to the belly because people can eat because of that. So on the one hand, it's a great gift, but on the other hand, it is a great doom to us. And we all of our thinking is rife with abstractivizing delusions. Stephen, tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, well, of course, another famous example is Schopenhauer. For example, sexual marital bliss. We imagine, a sexual partner and having marital bliss, and of course, Schopenhauer famously says that's just nature's way of fooling you, you sucker.
Yes. Everything that we think about in abstracted, cartoonish caricature versions of the real thing. And it's okay to have those caricatures. They can be very convenient as shorthands to thought. But what's not okay is to be ruled by those caricatures and to let those sketches and models replace empirical reality. Because as we were saying at the beginning of the call, yeah, Mother Nature is not stupid, but you're free to think that she is and fall off a cliff and die, which is what happens to people who do not respect the laws of nature, the actual empirical evidence of reality. As Hannah Arendt says in Between Past and Future in her seventh essay that she added to the late 1960s edition, the one that has 8 essays, not the earlier one that has 6 essays. Truth in Politics is the name of the essay. She says, we have become so abstracted and so caught up in democratic, populist, demotic ways of making decisions that we've entered a world where people think that they have a right to vote on whether anything is real. And that if they don't like your opinion, they can shout you down and say, well, you're wrong. And because there's more of them than there are of you, they're right. And they are mistaking political truth for empirical truth. It says, if you are the only one to look out your backyard and see a northern flicker land on a branch and call 3 times and fly off, even if everybody else in the world votes against you, they're all wrong. And you're the one who's right. because it really did happen. And the only way to know that is empirically. You simply cannot calculate that as a result of abstractions or mathematical formulae, like she contrasts it with the Pythagorean theorem. Anybody can figure out the Pythagorean theorem, but nobody can figure out whether that northern flicker actually landed in an abstract way. It has to be through concrete knowledge. Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Oh, Whitehead, the British philosopher of the last century, he sort of expanded on Hegel's observation, what he called the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. It's kind of the particular error that we make when we abstract is that we come to view our abstractions as more real than the phenomena from which we abstracted them. It's not that we can't stop abstracting or that abstracting isn't useful or something along that line. We should give it up. It's that we miscategorize, which is, I guess, what would you say, ontologically superior. And
Yeah, that's right. That's right. We this is why the priorities among nature, God, and man are so important to defining an epoch. Because the Greeks understood that what actually happens in nature, right, kata phusei, what actually happens according to nature has to override every other source of truth. If the northern flicker actually landed in your backyard, then that's the truth. And all your logical arguments and mathematical formulas and all your voting and every other scheme you have to try to arrive at a decision, it's all wrong. It's all bullshit. You have to understand that it has to remain human ways of deducing or calculating the truth have to remain subordinate to the actual nature of the situation itself and what
Well,
truly.
just as long as Chauncey Gardner doesn't work out that he can't walk on water, we'll be right.
For those who don't know what he's talking about, it's the film Being There with Peter Sellers, and it was, wasn't it? Oh, and I misspelled his name. Wasn't it his last film? I think it was his last film. Uh, Famously, Peter Sellers was a bit insane. Everybody who worked closely with him said the man had no personal identity whatsoever. He was such a chameleon that he just was a chameleon. That's who he was. And he would in the Pink Panther movies as Inspector Clouseau, he has Clouseau constantly trying to impersonate. Now he's going to impersonate a caricature of a Chinese man. Now he's going to try to impersonate a French gendarme. Now he constantly becomes these characters, and it's insane and buffoonish to watch. But it's even crazier when all of his directors and co-writers say, that's not acting. That's who he is. He actually has no sense of self and just becomes other people. And in Being There, his last film, he's playing a sort of mentally slow gardener who works near the White House and gets confused for a man of wisdom because he's only able to speak in simple sentences that are very closely connected to nature. Yeah, but everyone's so tired of the bullshit of Washington, D.C. that he's a breath of fresh air at every party. They're all,
Very Nixon-like president.
yes, yes. It's like there's all this corruption, there's all this affectation, there's all this posturing, and in comes this guy who says, it's hard in the winter, but in the spring the birds come. And everyone goes, oh yeah. That's the stuff right there. And on the one hand, it's hilarious because, he doesn't know exactly what he's saying.
He was the last president that ever had an IQ, actually.
Yes. So on the one hand, it's hilarious, but on the other hand, the film is saying exactly what we're talking about. Chauncey Gardner is in fact more closely connected to nature because his noesis is not enough developed for him to get very far away from it. And as a result of that, as Stephen alludes to, at the end of the film, not knowing any better, he walks away and walks on water. It's like Jesus, because he doesn't know he can't do it. It's a remarkable moment in the film.
Well,
So
that was going to be the sequel, wasn't it?
you wonder, you wonder. Anyway, wherever that was going, it's a nice reference. So here's the thing: we are beset with multiple sources of delusion, and in each case, whether it's coming from the begriff, the naive gnosis that is so concrete that it can't get away from our feelings and our memories and our experiences, whether it's that kind of delusion, or whether it is the Verstand, the naive noesis, that is all wrapped up in the world of things we've learned, systems, logics, calculations, artificial intelligence, things that try to think for us without any empiricism, that try to deduce the truth. The Sherlock Holmes. I only have two clues to rub together, but from that I shall figure out the entire crime and the 72 people who were involved and where they all lived and what they all did. And that's the fantasy of noesis, that you don't need that stinky evidence. One or two pieces is enough, and you can just think your way to success. Now, this is how we've built the modern world. When you look at the structure of our laws, you look at the structure of our economy and everything else. And if you look at the structure of our education, you see that it is hyper-focused on teaching us to be noetic, to be as abstracted as possible, to be as disconnected from values and reality as possible. Because as Phil would say if he were here, we care more about the nature too that we've created, the artificial world that we inhabit, than we do about the nature one, which is the foundation for everything. And so we don't teach nature one, we teach nature two. All right, so what are the sorts of things? I'll just cite some examples. There is no evidence that the model that sees politics as divided between the left, the center, and the right has any basis in reality. Zero. Zip. None. You know when it was relevant? During the French Revolution. In the lead up to the French Revolution, people actually went to the left court or the right court because they couldn't agree on the basics. And the people who mostly agreed with each other went to one or the other. And then that became the basis of the politics in France leading into the French Revolution. That was the left wing and the right wing. That was real. It was two actual groups. But everything since then has been this arm wavy abstraction that attempts to model the opinions of, and let's face it, this is a time when there is royalty and they're oppressing the hell out of the peasants, right? And soon come the guillotines, right? This is the circumstances on which we are attempting to map every kind of politics that occurs in the modern world, whether there's kings involved or not, whether there's peasants involved or not, or guillotines. And yet we're all sure, we all attach ourselves to these identities. There's people say, well, I'm a liberal. Well, are you? What the hell is a liberal? Where is the document that shows us what a liberal is? And the answer is, well, there's 7,000 documents and they all disagree with each other. Also, the window for what counts as liberal keeps moving in the United States. Well, decade by decade, it moves somewhere else. And yet people don't notice the change. It's insane. Equally insane as the right. Right? I mean, what counts as right? Well, in Eisenhower's time, to be a Republican meant you were pro-union, you were pro-environmental laws, right? School education, feeding children for school. These are Republican positions. But today, even the Democrats don't want to take those positions because that's crazy left-wing stuff. So where is the there? Right? How do we define what right and left are? And the answer is we don't. We use them as replacements for thinking. They're empty circles and they move around in ways that we don't quite understand and we don't really pay attention to. And we attach ourselves to a brand, whether we brand ourselves liberal or conservative, without having any clear idea what those things mean. We might know what we mean by liberal or conservative, but when a politician stands up and tells us he's one of us, we have no earthly idea whether he means a single word that he's saying. And many of them don't. What they mean is, give me the money so I can get reelected. That's what I believe in. I believe in reelections. So I bring this up because I just finished, last month, I finished, it must have taken me 3 months. I read through, I've mentioned this before, Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism, and I'm starting a big run through on Facebook. I might move it to Substack or someplace like that, where I'm going to go through, like we're going through Kenneth Smith now. I'm going to go through the whole book from beginning to end and try to get people stimulated into discussions and so on. And she makes a point in there that's extremely important, when she talks about, how awful Nazi Germany was, and she should know they almost murdered her twice. I mean, there's a biography, a cartoon biography that you can buy called The Two Escapes of Hannah Arendt, about how she nearly died twice. And the first time, at least, it was because she was studying totalitarianism and anti-Semitism that got her caught. She got busted using resources at a time when it was illegal. It was illegal to even study anti-Semitism. You were supposed to just go along with it. Anyway, one of the things that and she also talks about Stalinism. And let me tell you, just like people on the right don't like what she has to say about Hitler, people on the left do not like what she has to say about Stalin. She pisses everybody off. I mean, a lot. You think cancel culture is a new thing. They canceled the hell out of her in the 60s and 70s. And it was only after she died that a bunch of people looked around and go, I don't know why I was so angry. I reread her book. It actually makes sense. But she hit a nerve with them because people had so identified with their brands, even though they don't have a clear understanding of what their brands mean generally, only how they feel about them, what it means to them personally, that they grew enraged when she questioned these simple categories. I know I know very well people today who are still enraged by her attacks on Stalinism. So how dare you lump in Stalin with Hitler? How dare you? Hitler was the most evil guy who ever happened, where Stalin just made a few mistakes. This is some people on the left still say this. Not most people on the left. Most people on the left are like, Stalin, I want nothing to do with that guy. But there are still some people on the left who are like, look, I spent 30 years, believing the Soviet Union about Stalinism. I don't want to have to change now. So I'm just going to decide that all those revelations about the tens of millions he killed and stuff, it's probably some sort of exaggeration that people make excuses in their heads to protect their brand. And this is what Kierkegaard says. This is what Kenneth Smith says. This is how ideology works. You can look right at the evidence. It can be right in front of you, and yet still you find a way to shove it away into the background. That can't be real. That can't be right. Because I know what's right. And what's right is Stalin was a hero who defeated Hitler. This is what these people tell themselves, right? And Hannah Arendt, as she says, later in her career, I'm not anyist. I'm not a socialist. I'm not a fascist. I'm not a capitalist. I'm not a democratist. She says, after the experiences I went through in my life, forgive me, I'm not a joiner. Because you people are insane. All of your groups are crazy. And some of you are trying to kill us. And I am not having that. I'm not down for that. And the ones who aren't trying to kill us are trying to make excuses for people who are trying to kill us. So no, I am not joining your little group. I'm not going to be part of your little cult or fad. And that means I'm going to criticize whatever looks like it needs criticism. And that means sooner or later I'll piss you all off, which she does. So, but one of the things that she cites about this, and this is why I brought it up, is she says one of the greatest obstacles to understanding totalitarianism is that the right thinks that it's a left-wing phenomenon, and the left thinks that it's a right-wing phenomenon. And each of them seeks to rehabilitate their own group. So there's two ways that this takes place. One is you get people on the left who say Stalin wasn't really totalitarian. In fact, totalitarianism is a terrible idea because it lumps these things together. That must be separated by an iron wall. Wait, let me rephrase that. So we must never allow the streams to cross. No, wait, let me rephrase that. They're like you're committing a category violation if you admit that Stalin did something wrong. And what you see from right wingers, so-called right wingers, is they'll say, well, Hitler wasn't a rightist; he was a leftist. They're all leftists. All bad things are leftists. And all that's left behind is good and right, because right is good. So this right-left thing, this is the way that people put their thumbs on the scales of justice to push it, to defend the ideology that they're attached to. And as Hannah Arendt said, and this is the part that I think is one of the most revolutionary things she says in the book when it comes to our political thinking. And I bring it up today because it goes right to the heart of ideology and what it is. She says, it was a mistake ever to care about the question of whether Hitler or Stalin is left or right. I mean, if you want to go back to the French Revolution and talk about the different politicians at that time, it's relevant. The ones in the left court are saying one thing, and the ones in the right court are saying another. They're like physically standing to the left and the right. But ever since then, it's been this arm wavy, shifting morass of thought that blocks us from understanding. So what she does is she shows how Hitler betrayed the ideals of fascism. She compares and contrasts him with Mussolini and others. Says, now Mussolini is a fascist. I mean, he virtually coins the word. He's really, if you're trying to understand fascism, you need to look away from Germany and take a good look at Italy, because he says he's a fascist. He acts like a fascist. He has a code of behavior, and his code of behavior causes him to act consistently in the cause of fascism. I'll give you a classic example. Hitler, of course, was trying to do in the Jews, among other things. And so he told his allies, you have to kill the Jews wherever you go. Help us with the war. Send your armies into these. We'll tell you which territories to invade. And while you're there, round up all the Jews and send them to our concentration camps. So Mussolini in these other countries and his army would round up all the Jews and then say, oh, I'm sorry. I'm not sure what happened to them. We must have, I told them to ship them all to the concentration camps, but ha ha ha, you know how subordinates are. Sometimes they don't listen. We're not sure where they are. We could look for them if you want. Maybe I could write you a report on how many of them we lost. I'm not sure where they went. And what he was actually doing is he and his soldiers were sticking all the Jews into the baggage train, and they took them all back to Italy with them. And Italy did not have a policy of exterminating the Jews. So they were just collecting Jews from all over Europe who were slated to be murdered and taking them back to Italy to survive the war. And they refused to kill any Jews in Italy. Because you know what an Italian fascist says? I'm here for the Italians. These Jews are Italians, so I'm here for them too. It's my country and my people that I'm for. I'm not dividing up into weird little groups who the Italians are and which ones I hate. We're Italy. I'm for all the Italians, even the Jewish Italians. And when I watch other people out there trying to exterminate the Jews, Mussolini, and by the way, I'm not saying Mussolini's a good guy and neither is Arendt, right? I'm just saying this is the nature of the fascism. When he's in these other places and he's told he has to exterminate human beings, he says, I don't see what this has to do with Italian fascism. I don't believe in any of this. So I'm going to sabotage what you're trying to do, Mr. Hitler, while playing dumb the whole time. And late in the war, this helped contribute to the breach between Hitler and Mussolini. The only Jews that died in Italy were killed by the Germans when the Germans invaded Italy and finally could get their hands on some of those Jews. But the vast majority of the Italian Jews and of the Jews who Mussolini collected from all over Europe, they lived. They survived the war. That's fascism. Right? Italy is for the Italians. This is fascism. Hitler says Hannah Arendt is a different phenomenon. The Nazis are a different phenomenon. And to attempt to equate them with each other is something that no Jew who was saved by Mussolini is going to want to hear from you. Because the difference is life and death. It is the most important difference there is. And yet people routinely just lump them in together. Because after all, they're both the right, right? All the right is the same. All the left is the same. All the left people did all the bad things that any left person ever did, and all the right people did all the bad things any right person ever did. This is the ideological thinking. The empirical people are erased and replaced with the categories, which become simple little calculations in an equation. And that calculation becomes so stupid, it's something that a piece of silicon, a piece of rock, it's as dumb as rocks. A calculator can make these calculations once you've substituted all the reality and replaced it with these simple little equations. I'm going to call on Donald in a second, but this is not the only example of how Hitler is not a fascist. She goes into great detail about it. And in this, she agrees with something Stephen said a few weeks ago. It's like, the Nazi Party might have started out on the right, but by the time it was a full-fledged phenomenon in Germany, it had become something different. And where Arendt differs from Stephen is she says it did not become the left. That's a classic left-right mistake. It became a new thing that cannot be understood within the one-dimensional thinking of a line that goes from the left to the right. In exactly the same way that people living in a flatland can't understand a sphere that passes through the plane of their lives, people who think in left-right politics can't understand what totalitarianism is because they're always trying to stick it somewhere in this line when it actually has other dimensions that don't fit and can't be expressed in that line. She does the same thing with Stalin. So please don't forget what you're going to say, Donald. I have to finish the left side to go with the right side, or this idea won't make sense. But I don't want to lose what you're thinking about. Um, so she does the same thing with Stalin. She says, leftists in the 60s and 50s convinced themselves that because the Soviet Union started out as a leftist movement under Lenin and the Bolsheviks, therefore everything they ever did represents the left. And the critics, by the way, of the communists say the same thing. This is the left. So leftists, quote unquote, would spend their time looking at all the good things the Soviet Union did. And there were good things, right? I mean, defeating Hitler, they took the lion's share of the work. Most of the bodies, most of the defeat of Hitler came from the Eastern Front, not from the Western Front. That's a very important good thing. And they can point to other little details. There's any time you look at reality, you will see a mix of good things and bad things. And if your filters are that this is a good movement that has made some mistakes, which is what the US leftists, quote unquote, would think when they looked at the Soviet Union in the 50s and 60s, you can always find evidence of the goodness. There's some goodness in everything. Even Hitler had some goodness in him. Disgusting, but true. Maybe Stalin's the exception. But anyway, so it causes people on the left to say whatever the Soviet Union does defines the left. It must be left. This must be left behavior. And the right wing, similarly, but for opposite reasons, would look at communism and the Soviet Union and say, this is what's wrong with communism. It leads to mass purges and gross 5-year plans and starvation, and millions die. And that's what communism is, say people on the right when criticizing people on the left. Again, quotation marks are on all of these lefts and rights and liberals and conservatives. But Hannah Arendt says, the thing about Stalin is he betrayed almost everything Lenin stood for, and not in some subtle, abstract way. Like Lenin put in place 5-year plans to try to fix agriculture because people were starving in the Soviet Union. And right up until Stalin pulled the plug on it, it was actually working. The amount of food available was increasing. People were starting to get fed, and the famine might have ended. But Stalin couldn't let that happen because Stalin was not like Lenin. Stalin was a new kind of thing. He was more like Hitler, says Hannah Arendt, and then proceeds to show chapter after chapter after chapter, historical event after historical event, how much like Hitler he was. And among the things that they had in common is they couldn't give a shit about the supposed belief system of the side that they're supposed to represent. Just like Hitler betrayed fascism, Stalin betrayed communism. Left, right, and center. He would take the people who were the most devout Bolsheviks and have them executed. The people who were the most loyal, he would trump up charges and have them executed. In fact, even random collections of people that were near to him that he thought were too competent, but had no other outstanding feature. They were no threat to him at all. They were just helping to get people fed, or they were, helping him to meet his objectives. He'd get them killed too, because he was not a very competent man, and he felt paranoid and threatened by everybody who was, in the same way that Hitler was relentlessly reorganizing the Nazis. So both of them sabotaged the things they claimed to believe in. Hitler kept the Weimar Constitution, the law of the land, didn't replace it, kept it right there in front of Germany the whole time, even while he betrayed it and sabotaged it over and over and over and over. And as Arendt says, that was in fact the point. Here is the law, and fuck you, you can't make me stick to it. I'm that powerful. And as she pointed out, Stalin did the exact same damn thing. He said the old constitution is never going to work. We need a new constitution for the Soviet Union. He called together all their best constitutional scholars. They made a new constitution, and they all agreed this is a work of art. And by 1 year later, he'd had every one of the authors of that constitution executed. Not one of them actually fought against him. They did the thing that he said he wanted them to do, and he killed them all. And then he did what Hitler did. He kept the constitution of the Soviet Union, while actually betraying it and breaking the law of the Constitution over and over and over in front of everybody. He didn't stand for communism. He didn't stand for Leninism. He didn't even stand for his own constitution. All he stood for was the massive aggrandizement of power, just like Hitler. And so she says, these two things, these two dictators are more like each other empirically, obviously, repeatedly, evidentially, more like each other than they are like the movements that they claim to represent. By the time he's done, Hitler is no fascist and Stalin is no communist. They have become something new, something that can't be expressed in the left-right continuum. But she says the reason why her book is the very first book to say this is that all the other intelligent people who've been writing about Hitler and Stalin up until 1951, when she finishes her book, they're all stuck in the ideology of left and right. It's become the Procrustean bed of their thinking. They are determined to hammer these guys into that left-right spectrum, whether they have to completely distort them and lie about everything or not, because they're so committed to their ideology, they can't think outside of it. They no longer know how to think about politics without this. They become hammering man, even though all the evidence shows that they're wrong to do it. They can't stop themselves. They're stuck in their thinking. Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind. Sorry to take so long.
Oh, I didn't have any profound insight, but a lot of this has to do with, and Arendt is good at it. What do we mean by a nation? And you see in there Mussolini. Well, it means the Italians. Well, who are the Italians? Well, they're the ones that live here, you know, and so that's who gets bound into the fascists. You know, the sticks that make up the bundle are the Italians. Now, Hitler was what we would call today a racist. That is, the nation was the German people, the ethnically German people. And so those that happened to live in Germany, but couldn't trace their ancestry back to this Germanic tribes, were not German, were not people. They were an impurity in the nation that had to be expelled. And if you look at these two things, you can sort of see what happens in Russia, because communism, initially Lenin, Trotsky, is universal. It's supposed to be universal, but Stalin is just a Russian racist. I mean, that's it. And it's that way today with Vladimir Putin. Yes, Russia can have, the country Russia wants to have a lot of the world or something like that. But make no doubt, ethnic Russians will rule it. They're the ones. In fact, well, I won't, it's a total digression, but I think there's a lot to be said about figuring out, as Arendt does, what do these people think the nation is? You know, and the United States is, in fact, she has, I think, a chapter or so on how unique the United States is, because they see the nation is constructed of people that believe and accept a certain set of foundational ideas. And that if you want to be an American, you should accept these ideas. You should know them and accept them willingly. And if you can't, you should go somewhere else. It doesn't say we should expel them, but it is, you know, and that's why you know, as we know, we're seeing fighting now, led by Steve Miller, you know, on what does it mean? What is the nation? And you kind of need to read someone like Arendt that talks about all the varieties of meaning that that word could take on and has taken on, to understand what's at stake. Find out whether you're going to be on the inside or the outside when all the fighting's done. Are you going to have to get out of there or not? And I was going to say there is one very popular book that I think contributed. I think I got my volume set wrong. My ears are ringing from my own talking. But
you sound good on this end.
Oh, okay. Well, I sound way too loud on this end. But I don't know. I don't know if you call him Theodore Adorno or what. The authoritarian personality, which was a big, where he studied all the sociology and all the psychology and says, all this trouble's on the right. The left is blameless. And that was wonderful news. Leftists all over the world accepted it and believed it. In spite of the fact that these are there are things that crop up in human personality through all times and all people. Even, gosh, even every parent at least likes to be able to tell their children what to do, or their brother or their younger sister or somebody, People just like to tell other people how to live, not show them, not educate them, just tell them. And they follow the same path that Stalin's, Hitler's, whatever, have followed through history. I mean, maybe Mussolini had better insight because as the sort of rump state left by the Roman Empire, knew that multiple peoples, that wasn't the problem. That was the strength. Whereas Hitler, not so much.
Yeah.
There's an interesting, I'm not going to go there. Keep talking. You're doing great.
Well, you might not go there yet, but probably by the end of the 3 hours today, you probably will, because it's going to be a wide ranging discussion. This is the kind of, just like Hannah Arendt offended everybody because she wasn't a joiner and because she critiqued them all, and everybody liked to critique the other guy, but they hated to be critiqued themselves because hypocrites. Hello, they're not on one side or the other; they're everywhere. It's all of us, right? In the same way that today, this 3 hours is going to be pretty offensive because I'm gonna quote a lot of Hannah Arendt, and even though she's writing in 1951 and she's writing mainly in this book about Germany and the Soviet Union and contrasting them with some of the other countries, it applies today. Her critiques apply perfectly well today because mostly people didn't read her book. They read about her book, and they talked to each other about her book and about newspaper articles and reviews written about her book without reading the book. And it's why reading the book is still a very rare thing to occur. And you can see it in the nature of the conversations we have. Everybody still wants to go left, right. While we're dissing left, right, another example, Neville Chamberlain. What was the catastrophe of Neville Chamberlain? Right, this is one of the most important pieces of this history that everybody has to know. Neville Chamberlain thought that Hitler was a fascist. He didn't know that he was a totalitarian because nobody knew what a totalitarian was. It was a new thing on the planet, according to Hannah Arendt. She gives the characteristics of what counts as a totalitarian. She says it's not like anything we saw before. Neville Chamberlain went into his negotiations with Hitler thinking he was dealing with a Mussolini, a simple nationalist. And so when Hitler said, look, I care about the Germans, and there are Germans who aren't in Germany, and they're being mistreated. First of all, that was true, right? There was a lot of anti-German prejudice after World War I. A lot of people were pissed off at Germany, and Germans were suffering economically. I mean, the good old Woodrow Wilson helped oversee the stupidest post-World War I reparation schedule anybody ever designed. It was impossible. It basically created World War II and the Holocaust. Those things had to happen as a result of the immiseration of the German people. It's not that the German people didn't do anything wrong. It's that trying to resolve World War I through, torturous, punishments, all it did was make a desperate, enraged people. So anybody could see that Hitler was right when he said there are Germans in Austria, there are Germans in the Sudetenland, there are Germans in Alsace-Lorraine, there are Germans in these places who live outside Germany, and they are suffering. And I just want a deal in which Germany can include these places so that we can protect them under German law. That's a fascist thing to say. And I don't mean that in the modern sense, I mean it in the actual fascism sense. And it could be. It could be. As Donald says, there's a fine line between nationalism and racism, and it's easy to understand how somebody could misunderstand it. Someone like Hitler could be saying something racist, and someone like Neville Chamberlain could be hearing something fascist and say, well, fascism's perfectly reasonable. Let's go ahead and negotiate. So he says, Britain will let you have the Sudetenland and these other places. And Hitler says, thanks, buddy. And now that I have those, why don't I take the world? And Neville Chamberlain sitting there going, I don't understand what happened. He shouldn't have behaved like this. I had a model for who Hitler was and what this movement was. And it came out wrong. And instead of stopping the violence, I seem to have somehow made it worse. And Arendt's point is, when you lump all the things you don't like under the same collection of names and make those names all synonyms for each other, which is what almost everybody does in their so-called political thinking. Even Chamberlain did it. The result is you do not actually understand what you're dealing with, and you pursue exactly the worst policies. There's nothing worse Chamberlain could have done than what he did, which was to embolden and strengthen this growing totalitarian movement. Almost any other choice would have been better. But he didn't know what he was looking at. And as Arendt says, nobody did. We had no theory of totalitarianism. We didn't even know how to recognize it. We didn't know it was a thing. So we treated it as something it wasn't. And then, as Robert McKee says in his book Story, what happened, the basis of Story is you have a problem, you're a willful character ripe for change. You try to take what seems to you a reasonable, minimal action to bring about that change. And instead, nature goes haywire and does something completely unexpected. And you sit there dumbfounded. I wasn't expecting to be eaten by a Tyrannosaurus Rex. I just wanted to go on a little tour of this park. What the hell is happening now? That's the nature of Story, and that's what happened in World War II. And therefore, unless we want our lives to be an object lesson to other people, we need to identify when we are shackled to dysfunctional models like left, right, and center. And we need to smash those models and replace them with a more nuanced, more empirically based understanding of reality. We need to take these models that we've attached ourselves to and stick them on a shelf with a warning label. Warning, I'm probably going to be an idiot if I think according to this model. Sometimes it will be helpful, but not every problem's a nail, and I got to be able to put the hammer down when it's time for a screwdriver. Ari, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah. I wanted to point out a couple of things that I learned that really relate to this, and at least from a biological point of view, give a mechanism of action for why human beings can be punitive, even when it's against their best interest, and just like get sucked into that sort of black hole. And it was an interview between Andrew Huberman and Dr. Catherine Page. She wrote a book that's just coming out. It's called like Original Sin, but it's essentially talking about a very similar stuff of how things happen in society and how it's at least relating to some degree with some biological footprints in the brain. So one important good example is it's classically understood that if like, for instance, if you see a picture, not really a picture, of a video of someone getting like stabbed in the hand, you feel like you're getting stabbed in the hand a little bit. But then if you would put 6 hands in a row on the table and then label them with groups, like in groups and out groups, like label one as Jewish, or basically you put symbols on them, you put whatever flags for whatever nation you want, something strange happens, which is when the nation that you or the group that you identify with gets, stabbed, you feel the pain, and when the other ones you don't, that you don't feel the pain. Not such a big deal. There's a stranger thing when one of those groups represents a group that is something you think is supposed to be punished. Let's say the Nazis thinking like the Jews need to be punished. What happens to the brain is that stabbing, instead of activating the insula and all that normal stuff where you think of, ow, that's happening to me, it actually activates the dopamine circuitry, giving you a reward. And so this is where, going back to this whole thing of where this is strange to, I would argue that really dopamine is messing up a whole bunch of things for us. But one of the things is it creates us to be very too much precision oriented in our modeling. We get very brittle, and then we have to essentially have scapegoats to make sure that our precision doesn't collapse. And that scapegoat is literally giving us another way to get dopamine when we didn't get it from our precision modeling. We're so addicted to this. And you see this also from like addicts, whatever, something goes bad, they could freak out and really blame someone nearby them and get really angry. And so this is, again, how it's really strange that if you can punish the person that did this, it would be very good. And where does this come from in a real thing, which is, I love how Stephen's saying reductionist again. The point is, I'm saying a real mechanism for survival, this is based on, which I think we'd all agree on, which is that when you see time and time again through different types of experiments, you see people are really quick to punish free riding. Free riders are the death of any cooperative system. And so people are willing to pay a lot of money to, so to speak, in these models, to punish people. And that punishment restores this sort of balance between free riders getting in and ruining any sort of system. And essentially, any system that's too cooperative will have lots of free riders, and any free system that's too hierarchical will be too rigid. And so what I'm really trying to point out is this interesting trade-off. And one of the problems for when you get too rigid with is you have all these expectations. You get into this like tit for tat trap, which is classic violence and mimetic envy, which is, again, seeing other people have something that you don't think that they deserve, and then by taking it away from them, you're like, how is that helping me? Well, now we can see that the person feels rewarded, and that we're often more guided by a reward structure than we are anything else. And so this is where it's really important to recognize these things, like wanting to punish people has a real biological value in certain ways, in a sort of a childish way, but then we need to turn it into a grown-up sort of version to give it the nuance and contextualization, where it puts essentially healthy boundaries on how much you can punish someone for whatever reason. So the work by Dr. Page really talks about this idea of trying to move from a punishment-oriented situation to just a Bayesian situation, like, well, what type of consequence would be the best for helping society? That is not a dopamine solution. That is a totally different set of neurotransmitters asking that question. And so in order to move into this, like, well, what would actually be best for us, you have to get out of this control loop, this prediction addiction. And that's essentially dopamine. And this is, again, one of these dopamine traps, just like another form of addiction that you could get essentially really high on, I guess. And that's where I'll stop.
It's interesting stuff. I mean, I'm always very interested in where the neuroanatomy and neurophysiology have come, because they've changed so fast in the last 10 years. It wasn't that long ago when we could only name a couple dozen neurotransmitters, and we only had a vague sense of what a handful of them did. And like with genetic and analysis of species, this is a part of science that's changing very fast. You need you need a fan like Ari is of neurotransmitters in your group to be feeding you the latest stuff, because none of the rest of us can keep up with it. And this is where I'm at with genetic analysis of species, and how different species and genera are being reorganized, based on, we thought this was one species. It turns out to be three. We thought these were two separate species. They turn out to be the same one. This kind of change, this is what I'm all over because of my biology background. And so that and evolution are something I'm constantly pouring in. And of course, Kenneth brings in a different set of things with his readings and his deep dives into different philosophers. So it's why you want to make a community like this. is, everybody's got their bits that they're pouring in that triangulate on the issue. Stephen wrote something in the comments that I kind of want to underscore. I put a little thinking emoji on it, which I think it's my first time ever using the thinking emoji, which I may now have to use more often. Anyway, he says, I'd have to agree with those scholars and historians who argue that totalitarianism appeared in past ages. Shaka Zulu's rule, Catherine the Great, and the Pale of Settlement, even certain ancient despots described by Aristotle. He wrote about those who treated citizens as slaves, effectively deleting the private realm just as effectively as modern dictators did. So there's a part of this that I agree with, and there's a part of this I want to caution about. And I'll start with the caution because I want to end on the agreement because I think the agreement is there's something really promising in what Stephen wrote. So the caution is this: you really have to read The Origins of Totalitarianism. You really have to read it. You cannot rely on popular definitions of the word. And and the quote is Angelina's. Okay, thank you. So and Vlad Dracul, as Stephen points out. So the thing is, like the word have you guys heard of Godwin's law? You know Godwin's law? It's a law of conversation. And it says the internet has a tendency to devolve into flame wars in which people just name call. And it's happens so often and so reflexively and thoughtlessly that people are always accusing one another of being fascists over the stupidest things. That's a fascist argument. Your taste in clothing is fascist. It's fascist to say that there should be more Vietnamese restaurants. I mean, the word gets used until it doesn't mean anything anymore. And Mike Godwin, who I'm friends with on Facebook, because of Godwin's law, I tracked him down and became his Facebook friend. I wanted to hear what else he had to say. He passed this law for the internet. He says it's a voluntary law, but a highly recommended one. And the law is the first person to call the other person a fascist loses the argument. You could have all the evidence on your side, but if you start throwing this word around the way everybody throws the word around, it's over. You lost. You lost control. You're no longer having a conversation, and it's your fault because you just blew up at the guy and you were histrionic and melodramatic in claiming that everything you don't like is fascism. Well, Mike Godwin suspended Godwin's law 10 years ago. He said Godwin's law is off. So the moment you see neo-Nazis marching in the street with fucking swastikas on them, it's okay to call someone a fascist if they actually are a fascist. We can't ban you from talking about the thing that's actually happening to us. So Godwin's law, even though it's been suspended, it still has a certain wisdom in it, which is, and this goes to something that Hannah Arendt talks about in The Origins of Totalitarianism. And she says, if you are fuzzy and vague about these categories, you will misunderstand things so profoundly that people will die. And sometimes people will die by the tens of millions. And in the future, it could be the hundreds of millions. It says totalitarianism is a very specific kind of phenomenon. And one of its characteristics is it accelerates and it has no limits. Much like cancer, there is no limit. Unlike fascism, there's no limit to the amount of power that a totalitarian wants. He wants everything. He wants it all. And it may take him a while to realize that, but he'll get there. Stalin got there, right? Revolution on the whole world. The whole world was to become part of the great communist, community. And by communist, he meant under me, Stalin, Uncle Joe here. I'm going to be in charge of everything. Likewise, Hitler wasn't thinking my subordinates or successors will be in charge of the Thousand-Year Reich. He's thinking me, I will be in charge. And the size of the Thousand-Year Reich is, at the moment I want the Eastern Europe, but anybody else who fights back against me, I'll take them too. And I'm willing to take on the whole world. Come on, put up your dukes. That they don't have any sense of proportion. Whereas, Franco in Spain wanted to be in charge of Spain. Mussolini in Italy wanted to be in charge of Italy. This is fascism. It has limits. It has a focus. It has things that define it. And so she says, you have to distinguish totalitarianism from fascism, from communism, from authoritarianism, from tyranny, from dictatorship. All of these are different things. And it's not just because we like to have lots of fancy words. But the differences between them are extremely important to understanding what they will do and what they won't do. And if you don't know what they will or won't do, you have no strategy for dealing with them. Part of her definition of authoritarianism, for example, is that authoritarians follow the law. Now, they may change the law, and they may change the law to something you hate, and it's going to kill a lot of people, but they change the law so that they can act. They're law and order types. You may live in a police state. You may have armies marching on the streets and machine guns pointed at you, but it's all legal. The law says. And she says the advantage that that has over tyranny is that under an authoritarian system, you can fight in the courts over the law. And if you can change and the legislatures, and if you can change the law, you can gain a victory because the authoritarian will remain bound by the law. But the tyrant hates the law. The tyrant wants to personally be in charge, and he wants his every whim from moment to moment to be what decides what people do. And because he can't stand to have any competing forms of authority, he will, first of all, break the law overtly in your face to prove that he can do it, right? And second of all, he won't stay attached to any principle that you can predict. He may say he will, but he won't, because then the principle becomes a challenge to his authority. And he can't have that. His ego can't take it. So he has to change his mind from one day to the next about what he's demanding that everybody do to watch to see who complies and who doesn't. And the people who don't comply, he sees as threats. They stand for something other than obedience to him. That's the tyrant. That's how you know he's a tyrant. She says a tyrant is a much bigger problem than an authoritarian junta because there's no predicting what the tyrant will do, and there's no leash on him. You can't leash him with the law. She says when we fail to make these distinctions, we literally have no strategy at all, right? If those are the same thing to us, all bad things are the same thing. That's what someone says who wants to stay home and sulk. But if you're making a civil rights movement like they did in the 50s and 60s, and you're planning to go out in the streets, you need to know exactly how the thing you're trying to stop works, because you need to come up with a viable strategy to sabotage it. And you can only sabotage it according to its nature. And if you don't know what its nature is, you don't know how to stop it. She says way too much of what passes for political commentary is just people sitting at home pontificating and whining with no clear understanding of what it is they don't like, other than I don't like it. And that's exactly what happens when people say, I hate the right's responsible for everything, or I hate the left is responsible for everything. She says, this is not thinking at all, really. It's just a tantrum. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, some of the things will send people into meltdown. And this word fascist gets thrown around, as you said, and there was a time when it was relatively harmless, when your society still had a degree of common sense. You could throw and bandy around words and it really wasn't going to go anywhere. But now, well, I never would have expected to be living in an Anglo-Saxon culture that's become fanatical. I wouldn't have predicted fanaticism, which is stupid me.
We all we all make that kind of mistake sooner or later. It's understandable.
Fanatics, their position on things is, total, black and white. They believe that their opinions are an absolute truth, but I don't know, how many absolute truths do we have? Some said mathematics, and now they're not too sure about that. But basically, and if you've been arguing this now, and it's a fact, you look into the history of fascism and even Nazism, they were socialist movements. The core of fascism and the core of the Nazis were socialists. Many of them had actually been in the Communist Party before they joined the Nazi Party. That was, my early lesson was that whatever they were people that liked extremes. Well, basically, the other thing is collectivist. Now, Nietzsche criticized socialism famously and said, well, it'll be an interesting experiment for humanity. I predict that it won't completely wipe out humanity. It will cause mass death, but maybe the lesson will be valuable, that humanity will look back and realize it was a really bad idea. And that was a thing. For example, the fascists and the Nazis idolized the common man. They were, you know, the medieval hierarchy looked upon the men at the top. They're the great ones. They're the leaders. They're the people down the bottom. They're just there to obey orders. The greatness in your nation's culture is found in your elite, not in the common man. For example, if the Lombards invade Italy, you know, people get this weird idea these German tribes were genetically pure from top to bottom. 10,000 Lombards led tens of thousands of other peoples into Italy because they liked the food there. You know, they had Huns. The largest group that actually outnumbered the Lombards were the Saxons. Anybody want to come to Italy? Come and join us. And the whole group gets called Lombards. These ancient cultures, the only people that ever claimed purity of blood were the nobility, and often they were lying. At no point did they ever say our common people down the bottom are pure-blooded. They're just there to be ruled by me, you know, who has the aristocratic bloodline, even though I lied about quite a bit of it. Now, the fascists and the Nazis were collectivists who believed their idea was the common man. This is the rise of the common man. This is popularism. The fascists and the Nazis despised their ruling class. Where the fascists and the Nazis were a little bit different, as they had seen the mess the Marxists had done in Russia, and they realised they need the people that know how to run things. We're not going to shoot all the people that are good at running things. We'll keep them alive as long as they do what we tell them. That was a definite shift in Mussolini's principles. But, you know, what is left and right? Left and right is really people that shift, you know, are in the room, and who's got an opinion on this? Those to one side and those to the other. But people will go insane if you tell them the fascists were socialists. They haven't even looked at what went on. You know, you look at fascism, you have to look at the history from World War One to the Second World War. Mussolini started out as a Marxist, where, first of all, he saw the Marxists were clearly wrong. They'd all agreed that the workers of the world would unite when the capitalists started the next Grand War. They all promised. What did they do? They all went to their own national sides. So he thought that nationalism is a force far greater than Marx was predicting. Another element is he saw what the Bolsheviks did to the Mensheviks in Russia, and he thought, well, it's not safe to be a socialist with this new breed of Marxists, because you're on the chopping block as well. As it worked out, this is in the Cabaret show, which was a story made in 1950, and saw this very easily. You know, it's still in memory. The capitalists and the landowners looked at the socialist fascists and the supposedly socialist Marxists and simply decided they didn't like either, but the fascists were the lesser of the two evils as far as the capitalists and the landowners went. They had a choice. Who am I going to pick? Well, definitely not the Marxists. And so because the capitalists and the landowners supported the fascists, people think that that party was all about them, and it wasn't. And of course, in the end, you see the same problem with fascism as with all socialism, that oddly enough, there is some truth in it, the free market. You can't always have a command market, and a command economy. There's something, maybe it works in certain cases, but ultimately down the track, for some reason, it doesn't work. I mean, the two survivors of the fascist era, Spain and Portugal, didn't really go anywhere particularly good in terms of economy. They became backliers, They were in a mess by the 70s. It was just a very rigid system. But I mean, they'll go screaming. I mean, this is another guy in Australia saying that Hitler was a Christian. The core of Nazism was Christianity. Well, Hitler might have been a Christian when he was a choir boy, but privately, he condemned Christianity as a crutch. It's, his policy was social Darwinism. Survival of the fittest. That's not Christianity. The guy said, "Oh well, he makes all these public statements about Christianity, and even in Mein Kampf, and of course he's going to say that." But where he says Jesus, he's talking about his own God, masked as the God of the Christians. His God was probably more Schopenhauer's. It was the God of blind nature, the God of the will. But the Nazis were planning to get rid of Christianity when they won. That was, to them, Christianity was an abomination. Oh, well, there's my rant. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. I see we lost Ari, but hopefully he'll reconnect in a moment. I think Arendt's line in The Origins of Totalitarianism is that just like the left and right is a problem for us, a hindrance to understanding how things actually took place in World War II, she would say calling Nazi Germany or Stalinist Russia, Soviet Union, either fascist or socialist is also a mistake. She says that when you see the definition of totalitarianism that she's using, it excludes both of those movements. So it's not just that we see differences um, between Hitler and Mussolini, or we could use Franco, or I always forget the name of the Portuguese dictator. Anyway, those three are good examples of fascist dictators. And so, on the one hand, we can see how very different Hitler is from them, and see that you're right, Hitler is something else. This is not simple fascism we're dealing with. But she says you can do the same thing with Stalin and compare him to other socialist governments. And Stalin is a different kind of animal. There are several metrics you can use, and one of them is that they believe in no program. Stalin and Hitler, they'll like you suggested, you can't trust what they say. They'll say whatever they have to say for propaganda purposes. But you look at what they do, and what they do is Salazar, thank you. Is its own testimony to what's actually in their hearts, and what is their character, what is actually motivating them. And we see a number of things, and one of them is they don't believe in the things they say they believe in. They don't believe in the laws they say they believe in. Stalin destroys all of the socialist structures, and he destroys everybody who believes in socialism. He kills them. And just like Hitler, He will not tolerate any competition from Mussolini or Franco or any other, fascist. He doesn't stand for those beliefs. He says he does, but then he blocks them and sabotages them. So the first rule is neither of them is fascist and neither of them is socialist. As long as the left insists on lumping Hitler in with fascists, the left will never understand fascism, is one of the things Hannah Arendt says. Because we have this tumor, this rapidly growing tumor sitting in the middle of it, and we're trying to mathematically average it into our equation. Here's Mussolini, here's Salazar, here's Franco, and then we say, and they start to line up on something that we could define fascism by, but then we chuck in Hitler and go, and then here's Hitler, and all our equations go off. So the exact same thing happens with socialism. If you look at Lenin, if you look at Mao, if you look at any number Castro, if you look at any number of socialist rulers, and you see how they operate, they start to triangulate on something, and then you throw Stalin into the mix, and all your equations are screwed up. They're all thrown off because, like Hitler, he's a tumor. His Both of them are about destroying all principles, all laws, all competition, all restraints. They stand for nothing. They don't stand for the socialist ideals. They don't stand for the fascist ideals. They don't stand for any ideal. The only thing they stand for is rapid, explosive growth, the elimination of all competition, all restrictions, all other loyalties. And in order to get those things, she says one of the most important metrics of these totalitarian systems is an explosion in the rate of producing piles of dead bodies. She says Franco killed a lot of people, but not at all, and so did Mussolini, but not at all compared to Hitler and Stalin. They were, I mean, and it's the same with Castro. Castro killed some people, of course he did, but Castro doesn't have Stalin's explosive acceleration of the scale and order of magnitude of the number of bodies. Year by year, the next year, you have to add a zero at the end and add 10 times as many bodies. Interestingly, as she points out, she says one of the most underreported things about Hitler and Stalin is that each of them had already written up a new wave of slaughter that they weren't able to put in effect because they died too soon. They never reached a point where they stabilized and said, that's enough bodies. And the number of people they were going to kill next, in both cases, was another order of magnitude greater than the number of people they had already killed. If Stalin had been able to implement the plan he had on his desk, the number of deaths in the Soviet Union would be 10 times as many as died. And Hitler was doing the same thing. She says, this is the thing. When we lump all these things together and we try to explain them as as socialism, as fascism, as anything else that we're familiar with, we're unable to explain why they have this in common and different from all these other systems. They never reach stability. Perpetual metamorphosis, perpetual transformation, the shedding of all beliefs and all principles and all laws is central. It's the core defining feature of genuinely totalitarian systems. And it's what separates them from tyranny. It's what separates them from authoritarianism, from socialism, from fascism. It says none of these other systems have that same carcinogenic, cancerous, explosive quality to them. I mean, Salazar, who did he invade? Salazar had no plan to conquer the world and make everybody fascist. Likewise, Castro, whatever he may have said, aside from sending, theoreticians around to various places to stir up trouble, they didn't make a giant army and go invade all over the place. He mostly wanted to run Cuba. That's socialism. You see the same thing in Vietnam, the socialist government in Vietnam. Likewise, they're not, oh, great, now let's take all of Southeast China, and then we'll take Australia, and then we'll take China. That's how Stalin and Hitler thought. But these fascists and socialists, they only flirt with things like that, and they don't actually do it. It's part of what distinguishes them. And she says, since none of us want to be in those giant piles of bodies, we really need to make this distinction. Because if we confuse a Castro with a Stalin, or vice versa, we are setting ourselves up for disaster. Because one of them will kill us and everybody we know, and the other one will, be obnoxious and awful and kill some people, and then he's done. He's the kind of person Neville Chamberlain thought he was negotiating with does exist. You find them in fascist and socialist places, but you don't find them in totalitarian places because totalitarian movements can't stabilize. They're unable to. So this analysis is really interesting because it upends all of our models. It's part of why I was so excited. It's why it was was it a week ago, Ari, that I said I thought this was one of possibly the most important book on the modern world I'd ever read. Um, she really finds the limits of all of our existing political economic models and points them out. And by the time she's done, you're sort of standing here looking at all your broken models going, I can see now why I have failed to understand these movements and come up with an effective response because I thought they were something else. I thought they were something that they're not. This is my core point. Anybody could refute Arendt, and many people did, but many people on the left simply refuse to use the word totalitarian. They consider it a bad model. How dare you lump the left and the right together? We all know that the left and the right are opposites. You couldn't possibly have Stalin and Hitler be the same kind of thing. That's just not possible. A lot of people on the left say that to this day. I have one in my family I'm arguing with. I recognize the appeal of trying to dig in and protect our existing models. But part of what's brilliant about her as a writer is that she provides the empirical evidence that shows why our models failed and what the price of that failure was, and how the new model that she's proposing doesn't have that problem. And it would allow us to have avoided those mistakes. If Neville Chamberlain had read The Origins of Totalitarianism, which hadn't been written yet, and if he had made a list, here are the characteristics of totalitarian systems, and another, here's the characteristics of fascist systems, and he had compared them to what Hitler was doing, even then, he would have been able to see that that negotiation wasn't going to work out the way he thought it did. But he didn't have that model. He was ruled by the ideology in his mind that told him what the reality was and caused him, like a funhouse mirror, to distort what he was looking at until it fit the Procrustean bed of his ideology. Every ideologue has the ability to defend their ideology. Every ideologue has the ability to make sense of the world. I mean, really make sense of it in a deeply satisfying way and reconcile it with their ideology. Because as Kierkegaard tells us, that's what an ideology is. That's what a delusion is. A delusion is a system of thinking that has the capacity to reinterpret the world to reinforce the delusion. It is the greatest danger of noetic thinking, that even when it's completely wrong, it can convince us that it's completely right. Now, we can see other people's delusions, right? So Stephen points out repeatedly on these the defects of hyperintellectuals, of rationalists. And he's not wrong, right? I mean, your critique, Stephen, I'm 100% there. This is one of the biggest defects we see among rationalists and intellectuals, that they are against superstition and they're against emotionalism and they're against irrationality, but they're not against the defects of intellectualism, which they can't perceive at all. The ideology has them in such a way that they can't actually see themselves correctly in the mirror. Yeah, I mean, Stephen's right on about that. And the thing that Kierkegaard and Smith are trying to warn us about is that we too have our ideologies, lots of them, that have us in their grip. And those same analytical tools that we bring to bear on other people's delusions, it's even more important for us to bring them to bear against our own ideologies. Because those are the ideologies that are in our way every second of our day, everywhere we turn. We carry them with us, as Heraclitus warned us. Ari, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I wanted to just briefly bring up again just but again, it's for the sake of adding some depth to the humanity of a person even like Hitler or Stalin, and that I think a lot of us maybe hero worship Churchill. But ever since I learned about this, I think very differently. I'm going to butcher this person's. It's really an Indian person's name, but the Madhusri uh, Mukherjee. She wrote this amazing book after a lot of World War II stuff became declassified. And essentially, the really sad, reduced version of this is that Churchill and his best friend, Lindemann, sort of ran things. And there were some cables between them that discussed the famine in India and that millions of Indians died, and really awful, awful accountings of that happen in this book. And that was apparently designed by Churchill and Lindemann to quote unquote punish the dog that bites the master's hand. And so now you think of like all the millions that that were killed there on purpose. This sounds a lot like fascism, right? This says I almost like the Lord of the Rings or something here, where it's like Churchill was a little bit of a fascist and you needed evil to fight evil, like something more complex like this, because what Great Britain had to do, and then the turning that on that own sort of sense that they used some of those same tools on their own people that they felt were misbehaving, that sounds to me so amazingly human. And this is where like someone like Churchill is often regarded as one of our great heroes. And this is where again someone like Dan Carlin tries to take a big picture, and he says that he thinks that someone like Alexander the Great in his time was actually thought of as someone like Hitler. He reveled in the slaughter. His favorite thing to do was to kill as many people as he could in battle and boast about it. Right? This sounds like the most awful stuff you could think about, but this is how you won, society points back then. And this is how they got their dopamine. So it's interesting that like, does that mean Hitler 1,000 years from now could be thought of as Alexander the Great? Right? Is it possible that people are going to look at him like that? Right? This is where it's really fascinating. And this is where I like almost bringing the Kenneth lens. This is almost what Dan Carlin is saying, is that depending on what epic 1,000 years from now says, if there is an epic, then they're going to have, Hitler as a totally different creature if he still exists. But it's probably more like a hero worship. It's probably more like Alexander the Great, some driver in society who is bold and, who knows. But I just found that really, really interesting that this book for me really again takes away the good and evil ideology of World War II, and these are just different organisms, ecosystems duking it out, and it's not fair to reduce them to some things. And it's really interesting to see that sometimes our most beloved characters do the same things that our most vile villains do. So yeah.
Thank you, Ari. I'll call on Stephen in a second, but yeah, it has to be said that when we're talking about scales of genocide, what Stalin and Hitler did, what Pol Pot and Mao did, as awful as they are, the number of bodies is smaller than what the British did in India. And the part that is in Churchill's Secret War is just a fraction of that, because you have to include what the British East India Company did when they deindustrialized India and made India had an enormous population and an enormous industrial base, and the British East India Company didn't want the competition, so they deindustrialized in India, and the result was that India couldn't feed itself anymore, and just unbelievable numbers of people died in India. And when you add that to what Churchill did, the sum total of the numbers is greater than the number of people who died in the Holocaust and the Eastern Front because of the Nazis, and the number of people who died in the Soviet Union and, God help us, again, the Eastern Front from Stalin. So yeah, Britain goes in that special list along with Germany and Russia of people who've done just appallingly awful things. And the result is Churchill's no hero of mine. I mean, I recognize the guy's smart and literate, and he played an important role in history. But wow, Was he not a good man? You can't be in charge of massive genocide and expect anybody to call you good. I mean, what was it they used to say? Grandma Himmler used to make a fine cobbler. It was the saying in Germany after World War II. The way people were always trying to excuse these monsters by, well, they had some other redeeming qualities. Like, I don't care. Once genocide's on the list, the rest of your qualities don't matter. You have now defined yourself. It's interesting to know that Hitler was a paper hanger, but it's not the core of of his contribution to history. Um, and I think part of what's important about this, and it goes to this. I'm glad you brought it up, Ari, because it goes to this question of our staid, established, sure opinions and judgments about right and wrong, good and evil. Which side is the good side? Well, that's our side, of course. And which side is the bad side? Well, that's the other one. And Stephen's right to question this as routinely as he does and say, well, let's look at our side. Let's look at our rationality and our modern, reasonable, rational, intellectual, educated culture and say, how much bad have we done from that posture? Maybe we shouldn't just be dishing out all of the criticism to the other side. Maybe we got to be willing to shake up our comfortable categories and ask questions about things that normally we prefer not to ask questions about. Um, I'm gonna I'm gonna call on Stephen in just a sec, but I just want to add another sentence or two, and it's this. We often talk in here about the existentialist framework of history or Kenneth Smith's model of human character. And one of the first things that Kenneth would want you to know about those things is that they are not a system that he expects you to believe with a faith. They're just hammers. When they're useful, pick them up and use them. And when they're not useful, for the love of God, put them down and let the empirical truth of the world, the existentialist reality in front of us, override the model. Because to abstract is to be in error. All models, even the ones that we talk about a lot in here, are not just fallible, but have a tendency to try to take over and rule our thinking. It is in the nature of noesis that it wants to be a slave to an ideology. We are like the alcoholic with the bottle. We have to be very, very careful. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I don't know if I agree that in particular the British had a policy of mass starvation in India. The population rose steadily over time. Food is a large element in all this. Things changed dramatically after World War II because of the tremendous growth in the production of petrochemicals. The growth was huge. In 1945, I think the world production was about 5 million barrels a day, I think it was. And then in 1950, just 5 years later, it was 10 million barrels a day. 1960, 10 years after that date, was 20 million barrels a day. 1970, it was 40 million barrels a day. It was in the 70s that it slowed down. By 1980, I think they had about 65 million barrels a day of conventional oil. And that conventional oil supported a whole load of stuff, which, the green revolution, you had pesticides, you had fertilizers. Today, worldwide, we don't have a serious problem with starvation worldwide. It's caused by wars. The world is still able to produce huge amounts of food, but there will be a limit. But Nazi-occupied Europe, the daily ration was about 1,200 calories a day. Is there a reason for eliminating people? Well, with some it was ideological. With others, it's pragmatic. You know, if you lose within, say, a certain area, you had Poland, France, Germany, a whole load of areas which were contributing to the Nazi war effort. You had to feed those populations to a certain extent. Now, if you could lose 10 million people out of that 130 million people, you could raise the calories per person. In Germany itself, people who were important to industry, soldiers and that, they aim to give, the 2,500 or whatever calories a day. You ever see those lovely pictures of those young SS men commanding the tanks, and they're as thin as a rake. So there was a pragmatic ideal there that if we eliminate part of the population, we can feed the necessary part of the population better, and that will contribute to the war effort. I think that was rather true of Cambodia as well, because, I mean, when it comes to a collection of klutzes, the Khmer Rouge were it. They beat everybody in the dumb category. They just didn't know how to run anything. They took over Cambodia and they didn't, well, we've won now, we control the place. How do you run it? No idea. We can't feed the cities.
I'm going to reinforce what you're saying by jumping in and saying something you've said before that's really important right here. It was worse than that. They said the problem is all the fucking intellectuals, so let's kill everybody who knows how to run the country. That's how we'll run the country. Gosh, who could imagine what the outcome could be? You kill everyone who knows how to grow a lot of food. Huh.
Well, yeah, who was it? The kulaks? We'll wipe out the kulaks. They're the bad guys. I think they believed that somehow the dumb people would magically become skilled and smart, which was to some degree, there was probably a small amount of truth, but just not enough. This is what happened. Soviet Russia was the same story, that they couldn't really feed the population properly. So let's eliminate the undesirables. Don't worry, one day the socialist paradise will succeed and we'll all be in happy land. And yeah, we just had to smash a few heads to get there. But that's unfortunate. But look at what we'll have one day. This is my big problem with these extreme ideologies. The promise, the paradise to come, just doesn't come. I used to believe it. They're down on me for being slightly right wing. And as I explained, I was a lefty up until I was about 48. Actually, I went a bit past there, I broke the rules. They say if you've never been a communist, you have no heart. If you're still a communist after 30, you have no head. Well, I went for a lot longer than that, but I did a lot of study and I realised, I think, in a slight sense, what Schelling's saying, that your ideology goes out the window when it hits reality. It'll work perfectly in a vacuum. Any huge belief system you'll have will fail against reality. Engels was at those lectures and he hated Schelling for saying that, because he was looking for the grand ideal, and Schelling's just pouring manure over the whole idea that you can have a perfect system. They all went to Schelling's lectures. Finally, we're going to have he's come up with something better than Hegel. He'll come up with the perfect system. And he simply closed the curtains on the idea that you can have a perfect system. So this is a trouble with pursuing, having any sort of perfect ideology. It's not going to work in reality. It's going to have failures in relation to reality, in relation to existence. So, I mean, as the pirate said in the movie, well, the pirates' rules are just sort of guidelines. We don't have to follow them
My favorite line from the
100%.
whole movie. It's more of a guideline.
But the warning about what's happening, say, in America on the left and the right is this is the street, this is the gutter. They haven't really contemplated these things very much. You know, your Aristos was a person who spent a time contemplating the ideas. It's a bit like, I know you're the Messiah, I should know I've followed a few. Yeah, well, you've had a few ideas and you've seen that, yeah, they have problems, but these people down in the bottom in the streets who are following an ideology, whether it's left or right, are the ones that'll cause a mass murder. Don't blame Hitler and don't blame Stalin for everything. Remember the Fenris Wolf? The guy, T-Wiz, the god who was feeding the wolf. The only honest god was also the one dumb enough to to do the hard job. There's a message in that he lost one hand. If you're running an army, that army is hungry. If it's the conventional army or it's a Nazi army or it's a Soviet, political force, these are armies. One hand is lost to the wolf. Your ability to do things is limited because you have to feed that wolf. So you can't say that everything Pol Pot, Hitler and whatever did was purely faulty ideology. They were feeding the wolf. They might have been doing things that they would have preferred not to do, but they had to feed the wolf. There's another long rant. Sorry about that.
That's okay, Stephen. So in the chat, I propose the Higson-Marshall principle, and it starts with what you said and ends with my corollary. Every ideology works until you encounter reality when the ideology has to go out the window. But the Marshall part, if you refuse to let go of the ideology, then it's you that goes out the window. It's like it is self-destructive to cling to an ideology in the face of reality. We all do it, but it's self-destructive ultimately. Um, and I also there was something I was going to say earlier, and I won't belabor it, but it was in response to what Stephen posted there at noon. So Joe, don't forget what you're going to say. It's going to take me maybe 60 seconds to say. The question is, after you read The Origins of Totalitarianism, I'm about to go through it a second time. That's how I'm going to do the group, is go through it a second time and take careful notes. Once you've gone through it and seen her model of what is and is not totalitarianism, how does it work? It is incumbent upon us then to take that model and hold it up to other regimes throughout history and ask ourselves, does this or does this not satisfy her definition of totalitarianism? And if it doesn't, then we got to hold up some of those other alternative government systems that she contrasts with totalitarianism and say, well, if Genghis Khan isn't a totalitarian, and I'm not saying he's not, but if he's not a totalitarian, then why not? And which of these other alternatives better describes him? And if we don't have one, then we should write one down. What this is the combination that is Genghis Khan, and evidently it was missing from our physicists talk about all the particles that they discover as the particle zoo or the menagerie. So we need to have a menagerie of political forms that is specific and evidence-based and capable of representing all of the big interest, like that, the Reign of Terror, that is capable of representing all the interesting, moments in politics from world history. And until we have that, at least enough to cover the basics, there is no political science. It's like trying to have a chemistry without having actually figured out what the elements are. I mean, you can have alchemy, but you can't have chemistry until you figure out the basics. And we really still haven't figured out the basics. I mean, the level of political science today is largely alchemy still. But armed with her book and other resources, we could begin to change that. And maybe that's something we would do in that other seminar if I started up, is catalog these things and create our examples. On the one hand, here's her list of criteria, and on the other hand, what Stephen's been doing in the chat. What are all the different moments in history or political structures that we need to be able to account for? So I think there's real potential here to improve our ways of interpreting what's happening and been happening in the world around us and in our history, that allows us to shed these ideological blinders like left and right. And of course, when we do that, we have to recognize that every new model we put forward will have its own ideological gravity well, our tendency to want to treat it as reality, as a substitute, better reality that works perfectly in the land of theory. And of course, the core of science is we have to leash that to empiricism to prevent it from ruling us, right? To say anytime the model turns out to be wrong, we want to be proud to say, ha, the model is wrong. And I'm the one who said it, even though I like the model. I'm the one who pointed it out. So let's improve on it. Let's fix it. Let's grow it. Anyway, it's just an invitation. Joe, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I mean, one of the things that I think that is actually so important, if really looking to stand against any kind of totalitarian type, even personality, is that totalitarians tend to want to gather, essentially people that are in a state where they're ready to be part of a mob, and become a mob of sorts. They lose their rationality in that situation. And what happens is something like a mob is the psychology behind it's interesting, because what does a mob do? It doesn't allow for any types of disagreement, right? So you're reinforcing your position. One of the things that I remember, even somebody like Pinochet, he would have essentially people disappear, and he wouldn't necessarily kill them. He did kill a whole group of them in a stadium, but one of the things that he did was actually had them. Part of that was to kind of create an environment where people could imagine what was going wrong.
Did the audio cut out? I'm not hearing you, Joe. Oh,
I think he froze.
I think he froze. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Joe, we'll pick it up again when you can, because I was enjoying what you were talking about. I'm looking forward to hearing the rest of it.
Yeah.
Well, there's a little bit of him. Yeah. No, I think you're too digitized, Joe. You might need another connection. Because we all want to hear what you're saying, but I guess that's not going to happen right now. So, ideology. So, part of what Joe was talking about is discussed by Arendt in her book. She says one of the defining features of totalitarianism is that its followers get transformed into totalitarian personalities. And she defines what that is and how it works. And she defines how the transformation happens and what the consequences are for the person's ability to form independent moral judgments over time. And she also describes where they are left after the totalitarian movement collapses. Then what happens to these totalitarian personalities in the absence of the wind that used to fill their sails? It's really interesting stuff. And it suggests, what I like about it is it honors the Greek dialectic between the group and the individual. It says these movements can't only be defined en masse, because now you're defining the group, but they're also defined at an individual level. What kind of person could be part of this group, could thrive in this group. And it shows that there's a back and forth feedback loop between the two. And that suggests that, again, if we want to understand fascism or socialism or any other form of politics, we would also want to be cataloging and characterizing what kind of people are capable of belonging to this kind of a group. What happens to if you're a member of, let's say, an aristocracy, what happens to you? What kind of person could be a member of that? How would their character develop and change over time as a result of participating in an aristocracy? If we don't define that part, we haven't defined the aristocracy itself. How's your audio? Are you, Joe?
Yeah, I think it's coming back. It should be this. I switched places, so this might be a little better.
Sweet, take it away.
Cool. Yeah, now one of the things that I was, and I think you hit on it too, is that um, people were kind of forced into a camp, and their bias is kind of reinforced continually, right? Because then you start joining the group, and obviously then that makes it easier to get people to do things that they wouldn't otherwise do, and that creates a new norm. And that new norm is actually, could be, be unthinkable at one point. That killing people would be, oh my God, nobody would ever do that. Well, when you start gradually, making it normal, and then you're able, there's an anonymity, anonymous part to that, in the sense that that you are not as responsible because it's part of a crowd. And when you're not as responsible, then everybody's like, oh, okay, well then it's everybody else is doing it, so why not? Why not myself? But this is the reason this is all important is for one reason, is that that's exactly when you stand against them, no matter what the side is. If you really want to guard, you guard against yourself. Even if you agree with the individuals that are wrong. I mean that are in the part of the mob, and you disagree with the people that are wrong. It doesn't mean that you don't allow just a group of people to take advantage of another group, and that's a way of kind of guarding against yourself, in my opinion. That's the most important thing. Is to, because I think we all have distorted views, but so then you just want to make sure that the norms stay civil. And if you, as I was mentioning initially, is that any totalitarian doesn't like any dissent. So if you do something right, the reason why is it because it gives other people permission to do something right. And that's where essentially they need to maintain an extreme dominance, and that's the thing. Something like Pinochet is like, you have to put the fear of God into them in order to ensure that there is no dissenting opinion anymore. So all that is to say is that the way to guard it, against these things is to always go against the mob. And I think that that's really a formula for protecting the ones that are at risk.
Yeah, Kierkegaard has a quote, right? The crowd is untruth.
Right.
The moment you see a big mob forming somewhere, it's not the most sophisticated, nuanced final position you want to arrive at, but you're right, an excellent starting point is, okay, I'm suspicious. Like,
Yeah.
how are these people forming a group mind, and what is the basis for it, and what are their ideologies that are driving them to behave in a mob-like fashion? And obviously you don't stop with that. You want to then move on to, and what is the behavior of this group? Well, maybe it's not a mob. Maybe this is a bunch of people who are tired of getting hit over the head with clubs, and who can blame them? I'm with you.
Right.
But
Right.
maybe it's a group of people with clubs that want to hit the other guys over the head, and it's like, okay, this is definitely a mob. I'm not for that.
Exactly.
But the starting point is if it's a dominant position, you have to question it. Kenneth Smith has a mostly sarcastic, but not entirely sarcastic line that says any idea that is beloved by almost everybody is ipso facto disproven. Because what unites almost everybody? Well, their appetites,
Right. That's
theologies.
the other, yeah.
We disagree about so many things, but it's like, give me what I want and let me hurt the guy I don't like. These are the things that unite us on a universal level, sadly, too often. And it's usually the fact that it's so widespread is evidence. You should be suspicious of it. And also there is just the whole Socratic, the unexamined life is not worth living for a human being. If everybody believes it, they probably haven't examined it very closely. It's probably something that has spread meme-like through the culture and been indoctrinated in everybody. And it's probably due to be taken out, and hung over a clothesline and beaten with a broom for a while to get all the dust out of it and find out what makes it tick.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I think that it's also important for, kind of, and I think you hit it right, the idea that we're giving in to our base desires as to the way we want the world is, but to be. But the other thing is, if you counter the mob, the other is that you're kind of it's a way of having an empathy because you don't necessarily mobs don't consider what the other person's position is in, the other position that the person is in. Sorry.
Yeah.
But because they're just going after someone, right? But they don't think about what it would be like to be in that circumstance, or even what that person, why they may have done, or what they did.
Yeah.
And so that there is this complete lack of empathy, but agency and contingency situation as well, right? You don't consider yourself to be, what would it be like to be in the other person's circumstances?
Right.
And when you lose that, you lose your humanity, and you lose your ability to act justly. And so that's one of the distinctions between justice and revenge, is that revenge is something that is not not rational at all, and and justice is something that at least there's a pause in between when you're acting. And so that's a really important point. And again, this is exactly the scenario that demagogues and totalitarians take advantage of, is that when people aren't thinking, and when they're only acting on their pure emotions, as their desires, as the way they want things to be, and who aren't either able to question or don't question why they're doing what they're doing. And so for me, I think that that's one way against both protecting against any kind of totalitarian type of behavior, even if it's in a small group.
Thank you, Joe. Much appreciated. So, ideology. So, I still don't have the right answer to the riddle of Fenris that Stephen has been posing us for 3 years. And I think, although there is doubtless, more to be developed from it in terms of answers, I still think it's very useful in terms of a question. Fenris the Mighty, what thing made from gossamers and dreams and these only the most fragile things, spiders' webs, how could it have become the unbreakable shackles to hold Fenris? And one of the answers to that is ideology, because ideological thinking reduces down our scope of being alive to the world and our scope of creativity down to little simple logical threads. So like left versus right versus center, that's a line. A line is a single dimension. I don't know how many people here have a mathematical background, but my dad got a degree in math, and so I was raised in a mathematical household. And I've never became a mathematician, although I'm very interested in it. But I have a lot of mathematical metaphors that I use as shorthands in my thinking, and sometimes they are extremely illuminating. So I'm just, for those of you who might not have the math, let me just put this into the chat. 0 dimensions equals a point, right? So if you just draw a little point on a vast sheet of paper in which there are all kinds of places you could be, but you draw a little point down in the corner, and the point is the only part of that huge realm of possibilities that has been defined. That's 0 dimensions. It's a spot, it's a location. And 1 dimension, yeah, equals a line. And again, if you just take a ruler and draw a line either from one side of the paper to the other, or draw 2 points and use a ruler to line up between them and then draw a line between them, these are lines. And they're just a single dimension. And as with the point, when you look at the whole spread of the paper and what was possible, and you see how much of it is being represented by the line, it's just infinitesimal. It's just such a tiny fraction of the possibilities. 2 dimensions equals a plane. The piece of paper itself is a plane. It's flat. It has length and width, but no depth. And we've talked before about the novel Flatland, that postulates a world in which all the people and their houses and their cars and all their little locks and keys and everything in it is only 2 dimensions. There's no third dimension. And then it's such a useful metaphor because it talks about how would people who lived in a flatland try to understand the experience of having a ball, a 3-dimensional object, moving through space, encounter their plane and pass through it and disappear again. And to them, it seems like a point appeared out of nowhere, and then it grew into a circle, and then it shrank back down to a point, and then it was gone. And that's what a sphere is to them. It's this weird event that happens. The concept of a sphere is unthinkable to them because they've restricted themselves. They are restricted to the 2 dimensions, which means they're unable to imagine, to even conceptualize the 3rd dimension. 3 dimensions is what we take for granted. And we might call it, Cartesian space. Space, yeah, sure, why not? Up, down, sideways. We've got all this range of motion, and we're pretty proud of ourselves for not being flatlanders or 1-dimensional people or 0-dimensional people. But the truth is, in the realm of ideas and in the realm of meaning, there are a nearly infinite number of dimensions. Because you can ask about the 3 dimensions of where something happened in space and time, but you can ask about time, right? Space plus time is 4 dimensions. That's one way of representing 4 dimensions. When did it happen? Where did it happen? You've now asked a 4-dimensional question. But you start asking questions like, why did it happen? Who did it happen to? Why did these people do these things at this time such that it led to this occurring? You can ask about what should we do differently in the future? Could it have been prevented? Does this represent our highest moral standards for ourselves? Was this pragmatic? Was this avoidable? I could go on forever with questions that really matter about a situation, and not one of them can be represented in terms of space-time. Any one of them, if you try to express why as space-time, you have flattened out the dimensions of understanding as badly as if you squash the surface of the round Earth onto a flat map. It's massively distorted. Next thing you know, Greenland looks like it's bigger than half the continents. It's crazy. It's a crazy distortion. But it's because 3 dimensions can't fit in 2 dimensions without massive distortion. This is the problem this is a way of expressing the problem of the Procrustean bed, right? We all know the story of Procrustes, I think. I mean, I don't know if Barbara was here for that or if she already knew, but we regularly talk about the bread of Procrustes. We talk about how Theseus right, was the son of the king of wisdom, of the city of wisdom, and he grew up in the country with his mother. And when he got big enough to move the rock and find his heirlooms underneath it, he knew the day had come that it was time for him to take the dangerous journey from his beautiful parochial childhood home to the city of wisdom, where he could go learn by his father's side. But the road was very dangerous and lawless, and there were bandits all over the place. And this is the story of Theseus, who becomes someday king of Athens. And for the Greeks, his journey on the road to Athens is about our journey to wisdom. What are the challenges that beset us and prevent us from ever achieving wisdom? And you can see this in the nature. It's not fully explicated. Somebody needs to write the deeper adventures of Theseus on the road to wisdom. Maybe if I live long enough, I'll write it, or one of you will beat me to it. But these villains that he encounters and has to overcome they're weirder than Batman villains. They're weirder than Dick Tracy villains. They are metaphors for ways your mind can go wrong. And one of the most famous of them is Procrustes. And Procrustes invites, it's a long road. You have to sleep somewhere along the way. Procrustes invites guests to stay in his bed in his house, which is what you're supposed to do. It is the core ethos among the Greeks. The host has a responsibility to the guest. Zeus himself says, and we know because Zeus actually destroyed the world with a great flood because they were so awful at the way that the hosts treated their guests. He spared only Deucalion and Pyrrha. This is the Greek version of the flood. Right? Because Deucalion and Pyrrha were the poorest people, but still, when Zeus came in disguise as an old beggar, they gave him everything, every last tiny twig they had, every scrap of food. They tried to be the best hosts they could, and so he spares them. This is how important the Greeks thought this was. Procrustes invites you into his bed, but when you sleep on his bed, he jumps on you in the middle of the night and kills you. And the way that he kills you is he's obsessed with his bed. He thinks his bed is perfect, and every person is imperfect. Some of them are too short to fit on his bed, and some of them are too long to fit on his bed. So the long ones, he cuts pieces off of them until they fit, and the short ones, he stretches them on it like a rack, and either way they die. He kills the guest by insisting that the guest fit the bed. And to the Greeks, this is the human mind. With its 7 plus or minus 2 things at a time that it can think about, we are limited in the dimensionality of thinking we can bring to any problem. And 7 plus or minus 2 is when we're at our best. Like someone who's not a morning person and hasn't had their coffee and it's the morning, it might be 3 or 1 thing at a time that they can think about. Or me, I'm an early bird, but you start to get around 8 or 9 and my IQ is less than half what it is right now. I mean, I'm dumb and slow and confused as bedtime approaches. It is not my prime time. So 7 plus or minus 2 is at our best. Frequently, we can't even manage 3 dimensions. Literally, our everyday experience of life is too complex to fit into our thinking when we're really hungover or exhausted or what have you. And the problem is that in the realm of meaning and what is to be done and how should we treat each other and how should we govern ourselves, there are thousands of dimensions. You can see why people would want to simplify and oversimplify these issues to try to make them fit in the Procrustean bed of our minds. We're at our best when we can at least acknowledge 7 plus or minus 2 dimensions to something. But most of us don't even want to acknowledge 3. I'm going to call on Ari in a second, so please don't forget, Ari, what it is that you want to say. But there's a point I want to make here. Left, center, right thinking is a line. We say to ourselves, when we want to be sophisticated and seem like we're really bringing nuance to a problem, and we might say, I think you're being too black and white. It's actually a spectrum. In other words, a line. We feel, bye Jenny, good to see you. We feel that treating a multidimensional cosmos as a one-dimensional line is the height of sophistication. Because behold, I called it a spectrum. That's what a spectrum is. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. It is a line in which the colors transform as you move from one side to the other. We really think one-dimensional thinking is all that. That's how grown-ups think. And when we say that, we're admitting that most of the time we don't even think one-dimensionally. We think zero dimensionally. There's my side and there's everybody else. My side is right. That's where the point is. And all the rest of the cosmos in all of its dimensions is wrong. And I'll draw another point and I'll put all of that into that other point. That's the bad point. My point is the good point. So when people say the left is right and the right is wrong, they're thinking zero dimensionally. And when they say the right is right and the left is wrong, they're thinking zero dimensionally. And when they say no, 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 those guys are all extremists. It's the moderates who are right and the extremists who are wrong. That's zero dimensional thinking. They're referencing the idea of a spectrum and themselves being in the middle, but they're reducing it to 2 points. The middle, which is the good place, and everything else, which is the bad place. 2 points, 0 dimensions. No line. This is 99% of political thinking in the United States. If you listen to the arguments, if you listen to the speeches, if you read the articles, the editorials in the Washington Post, the New York Times, whatever source you like, it's almost all zero-dimensional thinking. This point is right, all the other points are wrong. So they're really just 1 point. They're the same point, the wrong point, the bad one. And now let's fight. The problem with zero-dimensional thinking is there is no outcome other than, and now let's fight. It doesn't allow anything else. You're all wrong and 100% wrong. And everything I don't like, all of you are guilty of all of it. Mussolini and Hitler are the same guy in zero-dimensional thinking. They're both fascists. And also, so are communists and socialists. And maybe I don't like libertarians. We'll throw them in there too. And I don't know about those eco freaks. Let's check them in too. And Bob down at the diner, he farts all the time and I can't stand him. He is also a communist and a fascist and a libertarian this is how we think. You see those crazy preachers protesting, carrying the signs that say God hates. And then there's like just about everybody you can imagine is on the list. And you get to the end of the list, you're scratching your head going, who doesn't God hate? Who's left? I mean, who remains after we do all this editing? What he's doing is he's proudly proclaiming his zero-dimensional thinking. On the one hand, I can see this enormous diversity of perspectives. But on the other hand, I'm reducing them all down to a single point and I'm labeling it, God hates this spot. And by doing that, he makes his own single spot seem like a really big spot, because it's where all the goodness lies. By coincidence, my opinions happen to be God's opinions. Who knew? Thank you, God, for validating that my every mistake is actually scripture, coming out of my mouth moment by moment. When we talk about political science, part of what we have to talk about is we have to carry with us this model and ask ourselves, in everything that we say, in everything that we think, in every model that we work with, are we allowing for a cosmos of meaning that could have hundreds or thousands of dimensions of nuance that matter, that are important, and that our model has to be able to represent? Or are we trying to strip everything down to 1 or 0 dimensions? Because the more we do that, the more we're being idiots. We are making as big a mistake as when the president looks at the Mercator projection and thinks, look at the size of Greenland. We totally need that. How great will it be for our nation when we own this vast stretch of territory? It's huge. How come it doesn't have an army as big as we do? We have to help defend all of that space. He literally can't imagine. It's just a little island and it has been warped through the distortion in our representation. There's no room for thinking that, because he would need more dimensions of thought. He'd have to understand that 3 dimensions don't fit on 2 dimensions without warpage. But most people they're still working on 1 dimension or 0. They're not ready for that scale of problem. And I bring this up not to mock other people, but to emphasize this is why Arendt tells us left, center, right is killing our ability to understand our world. Because on the one hand, at its best, it's 1-dimensional thinking, but in practice, it's almost always 0-dimensional thinking. And the actual problems we face will not respect our refusal to acknowledge the full complexity of the problems. They'll just run us right down like an elephant trampling a mouse. Although notoriously, elephants are surprisingly good at noticing what's at their feet. But it's a metaphor. Ari, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I wanted to say two things. First, I guess I'll try and show a cool magic math trick that's based on your thing. And then I was going to describe an interesting property of information that, that may or may not throw a wrench in one of the things you were saying, at least based on math and what physics call out information. So okay, so first we'll start with let's call this two-dimensional thinking. And let's say you got my thumbs over here. You got a guy over here and a guy over here, and they got big problems and they can't get along. And you need them to get along. Essentially, you got these two endpoints and they're mutually exclusive, kind of like you said, you got to pick one or the other, right? So how do you solve this problem? So mathematically, you add a little curvature. You create another dimension. What happens is, oh, it forms a circle. And now these 2 points that were separate are the same place. You can have a paradox, which is what life seems to do, align these things, right? These things that would be mutually exclusive, right? So in fact, they're existing like this and they're existing like this at the same time. So this is where it works. Anyways, so that's the first cool math trick that I think is really nice. And then the next part is a really weird idea in seems to be maybe a basis for information theory, but it has to do with something called holography, which is essentially this holographic theory that's going on that the universe is actually a hologram. And simulation theory is based on this. And it's this weird thing that was discovered that when you're mapping a black hole or whatever this stuff is, the amount of information in the system is actually measured not by its volume, but by its surface area. And that is weird because now it's interesting on higher dimensional thinking, you can have a 7-dimensional space, but that suggests something like the information is mapped on 6 degrees of freedom, not 7. So the surface area is, I think, 1 lower. But the point is, there's like this, what? Wouldn't information be the whole thing? Like, why is it 1 less? What's going on here? And so that's kind of a weird mystery, but people make their own stories out of it. And it's not really well explained. And it's also not necessarily sure if this is just a physics and a math trick, or this is actually like how information really works, because it seems to be the real thing, at least for a lot of physics and math people, because it accurately maps the universe when they're like doing their Webb telescope stuff, and that's pretty impressive. If it's going to work there, I would imagine they claim things like invariance, this kind of stuff is going to work elsewhere. To me, that's pretty convincing. And so nobody's really proved any of this in like a computer or anything. I don't think it's the same type of thing because it's like you have to work with perfectly spherical atoms that are completely idealistic in your math equations that don't exist in reality, right? So you have to create these fake widgets to model things, and then it works out with these quarks and these whatever. But the point is, I don't think anybody's done this, but it is interesting to say that information is not the same thing as everything's there, at least in the full dimensionality. And I think because maybe information is some sort of reduced form of whatever, if it's like 4 dimensions, then you can map it 3-dimensionally without losing any information. Seems really strange. I can collapse a whole degree of freedom and not lose any information. Like that seems impossible, right? That seems like a weird magic trick. That's like if I were to turn us 3-dimensional creatures into a 2-dimensional creature, you don't lose any information. Like I think that's bullshit, right? But apparently that's what the math in the universe seems to be telling us. So if information does work like this, that means at least information is for sure a funny creature, and it's not necessarily easy to pin down. But also at the same time, it's cool. I think it's doing these magic tricks that's allowing things to associate in different ways. But I'd also just point out that it's interesting that this seems to underwrite under other seems to be like natural dichotomies in the universe, these dialectics, because essentially if it is like you want to reduce it to a surface area, if you're going to move in this direction more, that means you're able to move in this direction less. And that seems to be a lot of things seem to be working on this, and it's called conjugation. And it seems to be like a really interesting idea that there's a lot of things that seem to behave like this. And the question is like, are they just a coincidence? Or is there something underneath it? Can we really say anything about that? It's a very messy area, but it's cool in the sense that there's some magic going on there. So I think I'll just stop there.
That's great. Yeah, there is a I almost never quote it, but one of my favorite Heraclitus quotes is, "Unless you expect the unexpected, you will never find truth, for it is hard to discover and hard to attain." And expect the unexpected is the shorthand version of that quote. And part of what he's emphasizing is that the limits on our thinking The our attachment to what's familiar, our attachment to habits of thought cause us to miss all kinds of possibilities that are right in front of us. And one of the best ways to see more clearly what's happening when we get complacent is to just find some core assumption we're making and shake it up and ask, what if that's not the case? Like, what if space-time is not defined by 4 dimensions? What if it's just a limit of our ability to think that makes us perceive it as 4 dimensions? And there's actually more going on. And I ask this not in the way that stoners will sometimes ask questions like, have you ever really looked at your hands when they're seriously baked? That's not the way I mean this question. I mean it like, have you ever really looked at a starling under ultraviolet light? Because to us, it looks like a black bird with some gray spots. But if you Google starling ultraviolet, you will see how starlings see each other, because starlings can see into the ultraviolet spectrum. And what they see is a wildly colorful bird that we can't see. It is right in front of our eyes, but all we see is black and a couple spots of gray. It's literally invisible to us. You can do similar things around the peacock mantis shrimp, which can see more than any other animal. It has insane levels of vision. It can see so many colors, and it can even see two different kinds of polarized light. So whole aspects of vision that we're just not capable of. And they see that way because it's important. They signal to each other. They are, communicating with each other in bandwidths that to us don't exist at all. We're living in a visual flatland by comparison with these animals that can see more than we can see. And that's just vision. Don't get us started on, a cat can listen to your heartbeat and tell if you're sick. A dog can smell a tumor in your body and worry about you. I mean, they've got levels of perception that we are missing. And to us, those dimensions of reality don't exist at all because we project our flatland of understanding over the more complex multidimensional truth that's in front of us. So one of the ways to deal with this is to always be on the hunt for cliches in our own thinking, right? What is expected? What are we expecting? Are we expecting socialists or fascists? Are we expecting left or right? Well, then we're probably misunderstanding Stalin and Hitler, according to Arendt. The thing that what is familiar das bekannt, and I can't remember the full quote, blah 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 erkannt, from Hegel. The familiar is for that very reason not recognized for what it is. Familiarization is a process of deadening our mind and losing our sense of wonder and curiosity about a thing until we just take it for granted. And then the thing that we've been sitting next to for 40 years might turn out to be something far more interesting than what we took it for. So a couple of little examples from this Arendt book. One of them in particular. What is a nation? Donald alluded to this earlier, and I've been waiting this whole time to bring it up again because the conversation has been so rich and gone so many places. What is a nation? Why do we think we know what a nation is? What makes a nation tick? We sort of have bought into this modernist concept that a nation is a real thing of some sort. It has some sort of real definition that represents the yearning and strivings of a people that is now reaching its fruition now that they can be a nation together. But other than arm wavy, patriotic bullshit, what actually is a nation? What defines it? What, for example, is not a nation? How would we know if we were looking at something that's not a nation? And if we understand what a nation is and why it exists and when it's healthy, then we could start to ask questions about when should it exist, but it doesn't? Or when does it exist, but it's sick? And how would you fix it? But we can't ask those questions if we don't even know what a nation is. We take it for granted that we should be patriotic towards our nation, at least minimally loyal to our nation. But what is this thing that we are loyal to? What even is it? Why is it there? Does it deserve our loyalty? Is it actually, progress? And in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, Arendt it's actually 3 books. It's 3 parts that build the argument successively to reach the third part. Her first section of the book is called Anti-Semitism, in which she gives the history of anti-Semitism. And that part is amazing because it's full of things that I absolutely did not know. Like she says, hating Jews is not anti-Semitism. There have been people who didn't like Jews throughout history, but anti-Semitism is a different animal than that. What? It is? I mean, this is Hannah Arendt. I mean, she's a Jew. She dealt with anti-Semitism. But why would she say that? Why would she make that distinction? Well, she spends the first part of the book explaining it. And then she points out that most of the ways that we define and think about anti-Semitism don't actually make any sense. They're like nostrums, a stitch in time saves 9. They're like things that we've all said to each other, and they're familiar to us, and they comfort us and make us feel like we understand something. Like, Christians have always hated the Jews. They've always been anti-Semitic. They've always been cruel. And she says, well, I mean, I know we all say that, but it's not true, right? I mean, just look at the history. And of course, your first reaction is, Hannah Arendt, what do you mean it's not true? Of course it's true. Look at all the examples we can cite. And then she says, yeah, look between the examples. How long did different places go without any anti-Semitic outburst at all, or any Jew-hating outburst at all? She says there are all kinds of periods of history in which no one gave a shit about hating the Jews. And that's erased from our model of anti-Semitism when we settle for these ideological nostrums. Everyone's always hated the Jews. She says, furthermore, if everyone's always hated the Jews, why are you angry at Hitler? I mean, you're just saying he's a helpless pawn of history, aren't you? You're saying it's not his fault. Everybody's always hated them. He's a victim, really. He's the victim. She says, I detest this position. It's like this personal responsibility. Paraphrasing Joe, she says, contingency and agency are both parts of history, right? We have personal choice. We don't have to act on simple impulses. And there are vast stretches of history in which nobody was mean to the Jews. And we just erase that from our version of history. And she says, you know what happens if you start to acknowledge that there were periods of European history when nobody was particularly mean to the Jews? It raises a new kind of question. And the question is, why were people mean to the Jews at this period and not the other period? What happened? How did it change? You start to be able to ask interesting structural questions, metabolic questions about the nature of this history that are impossible when you say, oh, everyone's just always hated the Jews. And this is how she goes about all of her reasoning in this book. She takes the things we take for granted, our little arm wavy, brushy things, and then looks at the history and says, does history empirically validate this assumption we're making? And if not, what questions does the actual empirical evidence demand that we ask? And so she says the empirical evidence is that, Jew hating didn't always happen, and that Jew hating is not the same as anti-Semitism. And now we can ask, why did anti-Semitism arise when and where it did, and take the forms that it did? Why did the Nazis do what they did? Becomes a whole more interesting question when we can look at the structure of it. My God, her section in the first part where she talks about how French Jesuits ginned up anti-Semitism, intense anti-Semitism in France, not because they didn't like Jews, but because they were trying to get the military on their side to cause a coup d'etat, because they hated the secular government and they wanted to replace it with a religious government. And this was just a convenient way to try to stir people up and cause a coup d'etat. And of course, it failed. It didn't work out. But they did manage to take a period when people weren't particularly hostile to the Jews and transform it into a period in which they were. And it was done for cynical, short-term political reasons. It is a riot. I had no idea that there was any relationship between an attempted coup d'etat in the 19th century in France caused by the French Jesuits and then having in the 20th century the Germans adopt anti-Semitism as a model, because they saw the previous example and how effective it was for motivating people. This was not anywhere in my understanding. But once she lays it out for you, all the evidence is there. We just couldn't see the evidence as long as we reduced the problem of anti-Semitism to a zero-dimensional point. Everybody has always hated the Jews. It killed our thinking. The ideology destroyed our ability to represent transformation and nuance and cause and effect. In the second book, the second part of the book is called Imperialism. And in Imperialism, she talks about the nation state and why it arose and how it works and what its strengths and weaknesses are. And she talks about imperialism as a particular form of the nation state, a phase of development. But the part before that, when she's talking about the relationship that Stephen just cited, a nation as a group of related people, she says, let's talk about racial thinking versus racism. Just like distinguishing Jew hating from anti-Semitism, she distinguishes racial thinking from racism. And she traces the history of racial thinking and gives examples from history so we can see what it is. And then she compares it to racism so we can see what it is and see that it is not at all the same thing as racial thinking. Thinking of yourself as a race is a far cry from thinking the world needs to be organized on a racist basis. These are two different things. You can care about who your relatives are without thinking that you want to dominate the world or this country. And she shows how the origins of the modern nation state were founded in racism. The transformation of racial thinking into racism is essential to the creation of the modern nation state. Germany is a group of related people. It is under the abstract modern sense, it has to be the land of the Germans, which raises a problem we never had before, which is what are we supposed to do with our neighbors who aren't German? That's not a problem until you have the nation state. But the nation state told you that you're structured around, the same race. So what are you doing with this other race? Who the hell are they? Why are they here? The ideology of the nation state creates the problem that magnifies the difficulty of racial thinking into racism. But I didn't know this. I did not know. I thought I knew this history, but I did not know the history of the relationship between racism and the modern nation state. And then she's able to show the relationship between the racism, the modern nation state, and imperialism. Why not conquer all these other places and make them all work for you and take all of their raw materials? After all, they're not your race. They're some other group, right? Which again, if racial thinking is not dominating your political economy as a structure, it doesn't even occur to you as a strategy. Not at that level, not at that extreme level. All of this feeds into part 3, which is about totalitarianism. But my point is, you would think that this book is mainly just about totalitarianism, but in order to demonstrate the structure of it, she pulls it apart, shows its emergence over time, and shows all these other threads that go into it, and how it isn't just that we thought that totalitarianism was fascism, it's that we didn't even know what racism was, or anti-Semitism, or the nation state, or where any of these things came from, or how they related to each other. So we were certainly not going to understand how and why they blossomed into totalitarianism. In each case, we had some simple ideological shorthand that was substituting for thought, but was familiar to us. And because it was familiar, we didn't question it. And we all repeated it to each other and nodded sagely while studiously not understanding the actual thing we were looking at. And because we didn't understand it, we were all taken by surprise when Hitler and Stalin erupt out of their respective political milieus to become totalitarian movements. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I've said this before, and I just, people don't seem to get it. They're talking about race, or they just, that's the French word for breed. Of course, in the Middle Ages, when they talked about breeds, they were talking about people over the hill, or the West Virginians. They're an unusual breed.
Those Yorkshire people.
Then came the scientific idea of race, as they call it, which has certain inadequacies because they had a much more complicated idea of breed. It meant a lot of things like language. Put it this way, an individual is not a race. When Hitler was beguiling the German masses, he was saying to every individual, you are the race. No, a race is invariably a group. You can't, take a little particle of the race, put it on a plate over there and say, well, that's a race. No, it is a race no more, because you've taken it. It's an organism that's made up of a whole load of little cells. Now, well, the idea of racial purity, you can have people who merge with that race which weren't originally the racial ideal, but they're still part of the race because they're now in the loop. Probably they use that horrible word essential, which I usually find people for. The essential question is communication and information. When a group breathes with each other, there's also all the information and communication. It becomes a bit exclusive. You have a view of the world, which is a bit exclusive. It's built into your language, the language you speak and stuff like that. Now, the scientific idea of race is not the same thing. It's built purely upon externals. There's a lot of stuff going on today where everyone's trying to build on externals. When people are trying, this is where the word vain comes in. Vain is where you try to build everything in externals. Like, if I dress nicely, everyone will like me and that will solve all my problems. It's useful to a certain extent, but if you think it's the complete answer, it's vain. And there's a lot of stuff going on today which is vain, which the church used to warn people against. It said, don't be too vain. But just remember that little thing and employ it in your thinking. Just remember, a race is a group. It's not an individual. It's like a company, can you, it's like a city council, are you going to take the garbage collector and say, well, that's the entire community. It doesn't work like that. But also there's something certainly built in the human nature, and that's what Mussolini realized. They will form groups, tribes. It could be ideological, it could be language, it could be just purely breed, it could be a whole host of things. Like the split between conservatives and the left at the moment. Well, you can see there's a different type of thinking. That's quite obvious, but it doesn't matter what supposed race you are. You can see that, the conservatives are all races and so are the left. It's a split in thinking. But people don't seem to understand this idea. They think, a race is a piece of jelly, and if you cut off a piece of jelly, it's the same thing. It isn't. It's a collective because we're animals that operate as a herd, like a lot of other animals. Well, I think most of them. We couldn't survive on our own. Eventually we'd die out. If I was one single individual, I'm going to die one day and that's the end of it. I think Jesus warns this one. When he said, 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I will be there. So he's implying that Christianity cannot be found in the individual. You might have Christian traits, but it cannot operate unless there's a herd. No, there's another rant, sorry.
No, that's great. You brought it back to medievalism. And Paul right? Who's the subject last week and will be again next week. Paul, as Sharon pointed out, Paul's very clear that one of his core goals is to talk about the community and how do we form communities? How's this thing going to grow? How do we treat each other? And as you say, that's a group phenomenon. This is just like you're describing, is Christianity as a group phenomenon. So the question that gets raised in all of these things is what is the basis for the group? And if Arendt is right in her analysis that the modern nation state, the basis is race, she says this is why, more than any other reason, more than any past history of conflict between Christians and Jews, this is why the Jews got screwed during the Holocaust, and why the Romani got screwed, and any other group that didn't have a nation. Because if the proper home for every race is in its nation, that is the nation for that race, and if it is that nation that is the force that supplies the human rights that they are owed, then the assumption, unfortunately, the ideological conclusion that none of the architects of this new nation-based system ever thought about is, what do you do with people who don't have a nation? What rights do they have? And as Arendt points out, it creates an ideological catastrophe. Where do you put them? They're supposed to go to their nation, but they don't have a nation. And in some cases, it's a people that used to have a nation, and we can say where the location is. But in other cases, the people may never have had a nation. Because remember, what existed in the medieval world and what existed in the ancient world, those weren't nations. The nation is a modern thing. It is a modern institution based on science and technology and this new emerging area of international law. And in the modern era, the Jews had never had a nation, and the Romani had never had a nation. So the Germans hummed and hawed and tried to figure out if they could create a nation for them, maybe on Madagascar or somewhere else. And in the end, they just decided it was too much trouble. So let's get rid of them. Because after all, if the German nation is for the Germans, the others have to go. You see how the ideology, the little wheels are turning. This is a calculation. It's thinking for them. It doesn't occur to them that for thousands of years we've lived side by side. We could just continue to live side by side. It's like, no, the ideology tells me who's supposed to be here, and it has to be the way. Everything has, the I's have to be dotted and the T's have to be crossed, and all the forms have to be, show me your papers. Everything has to be filled out and organized and orderly. Everybody gets a number, and the number goes on a computer card, and the IBM computers will calculate where everybody goes. And this is the orderly world that is being not just rolled out by the Germans, but was being rolled out by the architects of the whole international framework of nation states that went back centuries. Is all based on these abstract, systematic organizations of where people go and who provides their rights. And the people who architected it couldn't think through clearly where the gaps were in their beautiful, perfect little system that wasn't actually so beautiful or perfect outside the realm of theory. And when the ideology encountered reality, and now we go back, right? What is that provisional law that we're talking about? The Higgs and Marshall principle. Every ideology works until you encounter reality, when the ideology has to go out the window. But if you refuse to let go of the ideology, then it's you that goes out the window. And this is sort of a Stephen Higson, Rick Marshall, gross oversimplification summary of the origins of totalitarianism. She says, the point is you can talk about race hatred. You can. And you can talk about long history of conflict between Christianity and Jews. And those are relevant, but they're not the only or even necessarily the most important explanatory factors. And it's why at his trial in Jerusalem, Adolf Eichmann could say with all apparent honesty, he didn't hate the Jews. In the Nazi regime, he was one of their main advocates. He was the one who was given responsibility to find a homeland for them, as he said, to put good, firm soil under their feet in accordance with the system, international system of nation states. And he tried to get that going. And unfortunately, his totalitarian leader changed directions before he could finish what he'd set up. And once the direction changed to let's just kill them all, then Eichmann was, as a good, obedient totalitarian personality, he's like, oh, okay, we're doing that now. Fine. Not because I hate them, but because, hey, I have a duty of obedience. I have to do if I don't do what my leader says, then I'm not loyal to my nation state. So sorry, Jews, I got to murder you all. Nothing personal. This is literally what he was saying at his trial. It's, you know, and to us, it doesn't make sense, but it's only because we're not part of his movement. We don't subscribe as much as well, sadly, we subscribe more than we think we do, but we don't fully subscribe to his ideology about nation states and races and everybody needs to go to their proper home. We don't have this obsessive sorting thing that the Nazis were doing. So to us, it sounds crazy on the surface. But then how are we treating immigrants in the United States right now? It is exactly the same fucking problem. Everybody needs to go to their place and stay there. The home for everybody and everybody in their home. Ari, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I want to share something that I learned recently that may or may not seem to actually map so well. I don't want to fall into, as Stevens say, the trap, but it goes like this. And grasshoppers, when they get sufficiently dense in sort of social like pressure to get into a density of groups, what happens is they start to their individuality that seems to be normally they're very individual. They seem to be very group oriented. And this changes because levels of serotonin rise drastically. This, which almost suggests that serotonin is the molecule of we, and that serotonin gets sufficiently high, they get into this weird groupish behavior that sounds very tribal, and they turn into locusts, and it triggers a massive dopamine response to become very aggressive and very essentially conquest sort of oriented. And this sounds very much like you have a tribal group of people will essentially get very, very connected to each other, some sort of weird loyalty stuff going on. That represents really high levels of serotonin. And these grasshoppers that are normally just want to feed on their own thing turn into locusts. Now, I'm not saying humans are locusts, but dang, that matches really, really well.
Yes. Yeah, and this is where I'll wind up for today. I mean, next week we'll get back onto topic, but I felt like we needed to do a deep dive on this stuff, partially because of current events and partially because all of this applies to what Kenneth Smith is writing about. All of this is grounded in the same philosophy. And how do you do existentialist analysis? And what should your faith be in your models? Kenneth wants you to cast a side eye at every model, including the ones you like. Existence has to precede essence. So, this stuff, it's so here is where I'll end just as a teaser for when we eventually start the Arendt seminar. It goes like this. Arendt says, what you see under totalitarian movements is a new form of human personality that we've never completely witnessed in a pure form before. And it's a form of personality in which one doesn't believe anything. One doesn't have faith in anything. One can't be a Christian, one can't be a Jew, one can't be an atheist, one can't be for or against anything. One can't stand for any principles, one can't stand for any laws, one can't be pragmatic. One can't act in one's own self-interest because you have to be able to respond instantaneously to your beloved leader's changes from one day to the next. And he's constantly testing you to find out who will obey and who won't. And the ones who won't obey are either murdered or they're just pushed out of the movement. They can't stay. The ones who want to stay are going to have to be willing to break every part of their spine so that they can contort themselves into contradictory opinions from one day to the next. That is the basis of being a devoted member of a totalitarian movement. You constantly contradict yourself and don't stand for anything. She says, this is a new form of human personality we've never seen before. And it's created in a mass form, like locusts, using science and industry and terror to transform human beings into this form. If she's right, and I still need to talk to Kenneth about this might represent a fourth character type to go alongside the douloi, the banausoi, and the aristoi, none of which really satisfies this definition that Arendt is talking about. She might be describing an extension to Kenneth Smith's system. I want to see what he would think about that. But it would be a strictly modern kind of thing. Unless, as we follow Stephen's idea about analyzing past things, we might discover some precedent in the past. But anyway, that's it for this week. I hope you all had a good time. I certainly did, even though this was an unusual one. And we'll get back to the text, Sharon, next week, and move ourselves along. Take care, everyone.